Somewhere between "this seems fine" and a coroner's report, someone invented a product, called it childcare, and the rest of us inherited the confidence. 101 times. Let's go. 1. You have probably seen the photographs. A wire mesh cage bolted to the outside of a city apartment window, a baby sitting inside it like the world's smallest, most unsettling observation deck. And you probably assumed it was a joke, an urban legend, or a prop from a horror film. It was not. In 1922, Emma Reed filed a patent for exactly this device, designed to solve what was earnestly described as the fresh air problem for urban families without gardens. The baby cage company marketed these to city dwellers throughout the 1920s and 30s, and they were adopted widely enough that Eleanor Roosevelt reportedly used one for her own child at their New York apartment. The cages were secured to window frames using basic hooks. There was no fall prevention locking standard. There was no load rating for the bracket. There was no minimum window height requirement. The entire safety system was the assumption that the hook would hold and that no one would bump the window. What you are looking at is not a relic of cruelty. It is a relic of a generation that identified a real problem, engineered a real solution, and skipped the part where someone asks what happens if it fails. 2. The feeding boat sounds charming. Long, narrow ceramic vessels with a spout at one end, used to feed infants who were not being breastfed. A sophisticated, hygienic solution for 18th century families navigating infant nutrition without a wet nurse. The charm evaporates the moment you look at the spout. It was narrow. It was long. It was ceramic. And no brush that existed in that era could reach the interior. Every single feeding deposited a film of milk inside a dark, moist, narrow tube that was never fully cleaned, and that tube sat at room temperature between feeds, cultivating exactly what you would expect it to cultivate. Historians examining 18th century English infant mortality records have noted that artificially fed infants died at roughly 2 to 3 times the rate of breastfed infants. The physicians of the era blamed the milk itself, blamed miasma, blamed the fragile constitution of the infant. The vessel was almost never examined as the source. That is because germ theory had not arrived yet, and without it, the feeding boat looked like a solution rather than a delivery mechanism for the problem. You were not feeding your infant. You were feeding the spout, and the spout was feeding something else entirely. 3. Before the benzocaine era, before the regulated pharmaceutical industry had opinions about what went onto an infant's gums, there was chloroform, applied directly to the gum tissue of a teething infant by physicians, recommended as a gentle topical solution. Here is what the physicians were not fully accounting for. Gum tissue is not skin. It is vascular mucous membrane, which means it absorbs compounds into the bloodstream significantly faster than the outer layer of your forearm. Chloroform is a central nervous system depressant. The margin between the dose that quiets a distressed infant and the dose that suppresses their breathing is narrow in an adult and considerably narrower in a neurologically immature newborn whose respiratory control systems are still developing. These preparations appeared in 19th and early 20th century dental and teething products sold without prescription. Chloroform's removal from medical anesthesia practice happened through the early 20th century, specifically because clinicians discovered the gap between sedation and fatality was too small for consistent safe use. That finding did not immediately travel to the over-the-counter infant teething aisle. The infant stopped crying. Everyone concluded the product had worked. The mechanism of action was not printed on the label, and no one was asking. 4. The Victorian perambulator was an engineering statement. Large spoked wheels, coachwork construction, suspension springs. The message was wealth, sophistication, and the correct approach to infant transport. The message did not include brakes because the early perambulator did not have them. The design philosophy on stopping was that a human attendant would always be present, and would function as the braking system. The attendants were frequently servants. Servants had other responsibilities. Parks had hills. The logical endpoint of this arrangement was documented in 19th century newspaper accounts, with enough regularity to suggest it was not considered a design flaw so much as an operational risk that could be managed through adequate staffing. Wheel lock mechanisms did not become standard on perambulators until the early 20th century. Before that, the accepted solution was to park only on flat ground and to maintain constant human supervision. Two conditions that describe an ideal scenario rather than an engineering constraint. What you are looking at is a product that outsourced its primary safety function to a person, then sold to households where that person was not always available, focused, or present. The engineering philosophy was that a human being would always be there. The human beings had other things going on, and the hill did not wait. 5. Victorian nursery wallpaper was selected with care. The botanical prints, the rich greens, the carefully designed patterns meant to create a stimulating and beautiful environment for the infant who would spend their earliest months staring at the walls. Those greens, the vivid, saturated, fashionable greens of the 19th century, were frequently produced using Scheele's green, a pigment made from copper arsenite, arsenic, on the nursery wall. Chemists of the era knew the pigment contained arsenic. The debate about domestic exposure risk was largely resolved in favor of the wallpaper industry, which had financial reasons to find it unpersuasive. What the industry did not anticipate was the mechanism that made it genuinely dangerous. A mold called Scopulariopsis brevicalis, which grows in the starch-based wallpaper paste of damp Victorian interiors, metabolizes arsenic from the pigment into trimethylarsine, an odorless, volatile gas. Nurseries were small rooms, often poorly ventilated, kept humid by the respiration of a sleeping infant, who was positioned as close to the wall as possible. Some historians have proposed arsenic-laden wallpaper as a contributing factor in historical unexplained infant deaths. The exposure pathway was real, documented, and chemical. The nursery was decorated to delight the infant. The decoration had a chemistry problem nobody had named yet. 6. At some point in the history of early industrial chemistry, someone dissolved opium in alcohol and decided the result was appropriate for infants. Not as an edge case emergency measure, as a retail product with cheerful branding, sold at every pharmacy, used routinely by parents who found a fussy baby and reached for Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup the same way a modern parent reaches for a thermometer. The syrup contained morphine sulfate and alcohol. The dose instructions were printed on the label as if this were a completely unremarkable product for a completely unremarkable problem. The American Medical Association nicknamed it Baby Killer in 1911, which tells you the deaths had been accumulating long enough for the nickname to stick before anyone acted. It remained legally available in the United Kingdom until 1930, years after American condemnation. The reason it stayed on shelves so long is the same reason it sold so well. It worked immediately. The baby stopped crying with reliable speed. The mechanism was not soothing. It was narcotic suppression, applied to an immature nervous system with a therapeutic window that nobody was tracking. Every generation of parents trusted it completely, right up until the generation that finally read the ingredient list. 7. The baby walker appears in a painting by Hieronymus Bosch. That should tell you something about how long this device has been in use, and how long confidence in it has outrun the evidence. The common belief has always been that placing an infant in a wheeled frame that allows them to move upright is practice for walking. Intuitive reasoning, mechanically plausible, and consistently wrong. Research published in peer-reviewed journals found that walker use was associated with delayed independent walking and lower scores on motor development assessments. The proposed mechanism is straightforward. Walkers allow movement without activating the specific muscle groups, hip extensors, ankle dorsiflexors, that the infant's nervous system needs to recruit and learn to coordinate for unaided locomotion. The walker substitutes for the neuromuscular feedback loop rather than training it. Each month of walker use was associated with approximately 3 days of delayed motor milestone achievement in studies examining this relationship. Canada banned the sale of baby walkers entirely in 2004 after emergency room visit. Data made the injury picture impossible to ignore. The United States Consumer Product Safety Commission received reports of over 200,000 walker-related injuries in a single decade before introducing mandatory safety standards in 1997. The device did not teach babies to walk. It taught staircases to win, and it delayed everything else. 8. Dropside cribs were the dominant design in American nurseries for decades. The sliding rail mechanism was the point. It made nighttime feeding easier, which was a real problem with a real engineering solution, and tens of millions of families bought it. The problem was that the mechanism that made it useful was the same mechanism that made it dangerous. The sliding rail degraded with use. Hardware loosened. The gap between the lowered rail and the mattress widened over time, producing a space sized with uncomfortable precision for an infant's head. The Consumer Product Safety Commission linked dropside cribs to at least 32 infant deaths between 2000 and 2010, with entrapment and suffocation as the documented mechanisms. The United States banned the manufacture and sale of dropside cribs in 2011. The ban applied to new production. It did not retroactively remove every existing unit from every daycare, rental property, and grandparents' spare room in the country, where they continued to be used for years after the manufacturing date printed on the side established they predated the standard. You are looking at a product whose primary design feature became more dangerous the longer you owned it, a quality that is remarkable in any product, and particularly remarkable in furniture whose entire function is holding a sleeping infant. 9. Direct sunbathing for newborns was not folk medicine. It was physician prescribed. Following the discovery of vitamin D synthesis in the 1920s, sun exposure became a formal medical recommendation for preventing rickets, and the guidance in popular parenting manuals escalated duration on a weekly schedule. Start with minutes, build to hours, with no upper limit, no skin type consideration, and no heat stroke protocol. The reasoning was correct. Vitamin D prevents rickets. Sunlight produces vitamin D. The part that was not accounted for was the delivery system. Infant skin has a significantly thinner epidermis than adult skin. It burns in a fraction of the time. The concept of infant-specific sun protection did not exist in clinical guidance during the decades this advice was circulating. The American Academy of Pediatrics currently recommends keeping infants under 6 months entirely out of direct sunlight and limiting all outdoor exposure during peak ultraviolet hours, a recommendation that represents a complete reversal of early 20th century medical practice on the same subject. The medical advice identified a real nutritional problem, prescribed a real solution, and managed to create a genuine harm in the process. The confidence was present throughout. The infant skin data arrived later in the direction of a sunburn. 10. The spring-powered cradle needed winding, like a clock. You wound it up, and it rocked for a set interval, hands-free, autonomous, and completely unmonitored. The foot pedal version let a parent operate the rocking mechanism while occupied with other tasks in the same room. These were sold as modern engineering, as convenience as progress. The patents date to the 19th century, and the enthusiasm for them was genuine. What the enthusiasm did not include was any measurement of the motion rate, arc angle, or duration that produced a safe rocking experience versus one that generated forces inconsistent with infant neurological tolerance. Shaken baby syndrome research, formalized in the 1970s by Dr. Norman Guthkelch, established that specific acceleration and deceleration forces cause infant brain injury by a mechanism that does not require impact. The forces the research characterized are the same category of forces a mechanical rocking device can generate. No motion rate standard, arc standard, or maximum rocking duration specification existed for mechanical infant rockers before electronic versions faced Consumer Product Safety Commission scrutiny in the 21st century. The device was called self-rocking, which was engineering's way of saying that once it was wound, no one was responsible for what happened during the interval, and the interval had no independently specified safe parameters. 11. The poor microwave has been accused of radiating your food into a nutrient-void shell of its former self for decades, which makes it one of the most reliably misunderstood appliances in the history of modern kitchens. You grew up watching someone cover a plate with plastic wrap and slide it in with the hesitation of a person who wasn't entirely sure the machine wasn't angry. The actual chemistry of nutrient loss in cooking depends on two variables: heat exposure time and water. Boiling vegetables, the traditional method, the one with the long track record of respectability, places food in prolonged contact with high heat in a water bath that actively pulls water-soluble vitamins out of the food and into the liquid you then pour down the drain. Microwaves cook fast and use almost no water. The lycopene in a cooked tomato, to take one well-studied example, is more bioavailable after cooking than in raw form, because the heat breaks down cell walls. Microwaving is among the better methods for preserving heat-sensitive nutrients, not among the worst. The real nutrient elimination device in your kitchen is the pot of boiling water, and it has been cooking the goodness out of your vegetables in a completely conventional, socially accepted manner for your entire life. 12. The idea that breakfast is the most important meal of the day did not come from a nutritional study. It did not emerge from clinical observation. It was not discovered in a laboratory by anyone with a hypothesis about human metabolism. It was invented in a marketing department to sell processed grain products, most prominently by cereal companies in the 19th century, and it has been repeated with such frequency and confidence that most adults treat it as biological fact. Your body does not operate on an 8 a.m. timer. It does not enter a metabolic emergency state if you skip the morning meal. The importance of breakfast is entirely dependent on the individual, their physiology, their sleep schedule, their activity level, and what they ate the night before. For some people, eating in the morning is genuinely useful for energy and cognitive function. For others, skipping it causes no measurable negative outcome. The claim that foregoing breakfast triggers some kind of starvation response is not supported by the mechanism of how human metabolism works. What is supported by the evidence is that companies that make breakfast food benefit commercially from your belief that breakfast is non-negotiable. The research and the revenue pointed in the same direction. Coincidences like that deserve scrutiny. 13. The detox tea exists to tell you that your body is failing at its own job and that the solution is an expensive laxative dressed in wellness vocabulary. The premise requires you to believe that millions of years of evolutionary pressure produced a liver and kidney system so inadequate that it requires supplementation from a product available online for $40 with free shipping. Your liver processes every compound that enters your bloodstream. Your kidneys filter waste and regulate fluid balance continuously around the clock without requiring you to think about it. They are not overwhelmed. They are not clogged. The mythical toxins that detox products promise to eliminate have never been specified by name by any detox product manufacturer, because specifying them would require demonstrating they exist in the quantities claimed, which would require evidence, which is not how this product category operates. These cleanses do not flush toxins. They flush water, electrolytes, and occasionally the contents of your digestive tract via whatever laxative compound is in the blend. Your organs perform the actual filtration without any assistance from the tea aisle. The only thing the detox market is genuinely, consistently removing is the money from your account, and it does that with impressive efficiency every single time. 14. The mercury teething powder had a name that sounded clinical and reassuring. Calomel, mercurous chloride, was the active ingredient in products like Steedman's soothing powders, sold in pharmacies with pediatric dosing instructions on the label and physician endorsements in the advertising. Physicians recommended them. Parents bought them. The powders were used on infants throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the United Kingdom, Australia, and beyond. The condition they caused had a name: pink disease, or acrodynia, painful nerve damage, hair loss, a characteristic pink discoloration of the extremities. Dr. John Bivings formally established the connection between calomel teething powders and pink disease in 1949, which means the product was in widespread use for decades before the causal link was formally documented. An estimated 1 in 500 exposed infants developed acrodynia. Of those, approximately 10% died. UK sales collapsed after Bivings' research was published. Some countries continued selling calomel-containing infant products into the 1950s. The teething powder worked in the specific sense that it provided relief from the discomfort of teething. The mechanism by which it provided that relief was systemic mercury poisoning, which is the kind of trade-off that appears much more clearly in retrospect than it did on the pharmacy shelf. 15. The instruction to take cover in a doorway during an earthquake is one of those pieces of safety advice that has been passed down with such conviction that questioning it feels irresponsible. You have probably heard it from a parent, a teacher, a workplace safety training, or all three. The logic had a historical basis. In older adobe and unreinforced masonry construction, the door frame could sometimes be a structurally reinforced point relative to the surrounding wall. That context no longer applies to the building you are almost certainly standing in. Modern construction uses drywall attached to wood or metal framing. The door frame in a modern building is a piece of decorative trim surrounding a hollow core door, not a structural load-bearing element capable of providing meaningful protection during seismic activity. Standing in a doorway during an earthquake positions you directly in the path of a swinging door that will move unpredictably with the building's motion in a location that offers no overhead protection from falling ceiling material. The current guidance from seismologists, emergency management agencies, and structural engineers is the drop, cover, and hold on protocol. Get under a sturdy table, protect your head, and stay there. The doorway survived as advice long after the construction type that made it marginally reasonable had been replaced by something else entirely. 16. Lead paint was selected for nursery furniture specifically because it produced vivid, durable color and adhered exceptionally well to high contact surfaces. The same properties that made it technically excellent for furniture also made it technically excellent at remaining on the surface a teething infant would spend the next 2 years pressing their mouth against. Lead carbonate, white lead, was the dominant paint base in United States and European manufacturing through most of the 20th century. The United States did not ban lead paint for residential use until 1978. That is the date. Everything sold before 1978 was legally painted in a substance the Centers for Disease Control has since determined has no safe blood level in children, meaning any detectable amount causes measurable neurological impact. Infants and toddlers are the highest risk group for lead poisoning because hand-to-mouth behavior is their primary mode of environmental exploration, which means the painted crib rail is not a passive background feature. It is an active exposure source engaged at every nap, every wake-up, and every teething episode across the entire first 2 years of life. The nursery industry spent decades making the most visually stimulating object in an infant's immediate environment, also the most neurologically consequential one. The colors were cheerful. The outcome data was not. 17. The wicker bassinet is still sold in nursery boutiques because it is genuinely beautiful. and beauty in infant furniture has always been a more compelling sales argument than the testing standard that governs the furniture's structural behavior. The Juvenile Products Manufacturers Association's Voluntary Standard for Bassinets, ASTM F2194, was not published until 2003. Before that date, no federal regulation governed bassinet structural integrity, stand stability, or the fit between mattress and basket wall. The mattress to bassinet gap is not a minor detail. When a gap exists between the edge of the mattress pad and the interior wall of the basket, it creates a space into which an infant can wedge their face against a soft, conforming surface that provides no rigid edge to push against. The stand joint in a wicker design relies on the same weaving tension as the basket itself, tension that degrades with moisture cycling and weight over time. A bassinet stand failure, while the infant is inside, produces a fall from sleeping height onto whatever floor surface exists below. The Consumer Product Safety Commission issued a mandatory updated rule on bassinets in 2020, after continued injury data demonstrated that even with voluntary standards in place, the category was still generating emergency room visits. The charm was entirely real. The structural engineering review was optional for most of the product's commercial history. 18. The swaddling board was not a fringe practice or a regional curiosity. It was the standard approach to infant care across Europe for centuries, endorsed by physicians, practiced by midwives, and depicted in paintings, hanging in museums you have visited on school trips. The logic was that an infant's limbs, left unsupported, would grow crooked. The solution was to bind the entire body, legs included, stretched straight, in firm cloth around a flat wooden board, and leave it that way. Agricultural households took this further. The swaddled infant was hung on a peg in the stable or the barn while the adults worked, a fixed, immobile, unmonitored bundle at hook height for the duration of a working day. What this produced was an infant who could not move their limbs, could not regulate their own temperature through movement, was blocked from sunlight by the wrappings, and was left without supervision in environments containing animals, tools, and fire. Modern pediatric guidance on swaddling specifically excludes the hips, which must remain in a flexed and outward position for proper joint development. The exact opposite of traditional tight swaddling that held legs rigidly straight. The practice optimized simultaneously for childcare, storage, and structural engineering, and it did none of them well. 19. The tightly laced infant corset was a product of medical theory, not parental carelessness. Physicians and midwives in 16th through 19th century Britain and Europe prescribed stays and stiffened bodices for infants based on the understanding that the infant's spine required external support to develop correctly. The natural curve of an infant's spine, the kyphotic curve present from birth, was interpreted as a deformity requiring correction rather than a developmentally appropriate structural feature that would resolve on its own schedule. The stays were made from buckram, paste-stiffened fabric, and in some cases, thin strips of whalebone, wrapped around a torso that was simultaneously completing the most rapid period of growth it would ever experience. External compression around the infant's ribcage restricts the expansion capacity of the chest wall, which restricts lung volume during a developmental window when the respiratory system is actively growing. By the late 19th century, reform-minded physicians and the dress reform movement specifically named infant stays as harmful and campaigned for their removal from standard infant clothing practice. The practice declined through the early 20th century as pediatric anatomy became better understood from the inside rather than theorized from the outside. The corset was prescribed to straighten a curve the spine needed to have. 20. The opium prescription for infant colic, sleeplessness, diarrhea, teething, and general inconvenience was not the practice of negligent or ignorant parents. It was the recommendation of physicians, available without prescription at grocery stores, cheaper than beer, and considered as unremarkable as any other household remedy. Paregoric, camphorated tincture of opium, appeared in the United States Pharmacopoeia from its very first edition in 1820, with pediatric dosing guidance printed as standard information. It remained legally available in the United States without a prescription until 1970, when it became a Schedule III controlled substance under the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. That is 150 years of physician-recommended, legally available, over-the-counter opium for infants. The product contained approximately 0.04% morphine by volume, along with camphor, benzoic acid, and anise oil. The morphine content is pharmacologically active in the doses described for infants. More importantly, the actual treatment for the infant diarrhea it was most commonly prescribed for, the condition that killed infants at catastrophic rates, is rehydration. Opiates suppress the signals that drive fluid-seeking behavior in an already dehydrated patient. The treatment addressed the visible symptom while making the invisible, lethal one harder for the infant to communicate. 21. The mechanical spring cradle was sold as modernity applied to an ancient problem. You wound it up, set the interval, and walked away. The rocking continued without you. Autonomous, hands-free, and by the standards of the 19th century, ingenious. No one measured the arc. No one specified the rate. No one determined what range of motion and acceleration constituted a safe rocking experience for an infant whose brain was suspended in cerebrospinal fluid inside a skull that had not yet fully fused at the plates. Shaken baby syndrome research, developed formally in the 1970s, established that specific acceleration and deceleration forces applied to an infant's head cause intracranial injury through a mechanism that requires no impact, only the movement itself. The forces that cause this injury are the same category of forces a mechanical rocking device generates, and they exist on a spectrum from harmless to harmful that nobody had mapped before winding up the machine and leaving the room. Electronic and motorized infant rockers faced Consumer Product Safety Commission scrutiny in the 21st century that began establishing motion parameters. The 19th century wind-up cradle faced no such scrutiny. It was called self-rocking, which was a product name and also a liability disclaimer, and both things were true at the same time. 22. The dropside crib was a dominant design for decades precisely because it solved a real problem. Getting a sleeping infant into a fixed-rail crib without waking them requires a maneuver that strains the lower back and requires both arms extended over a rail at waist height, an awkward daily difficulty that a sliding rail mechanism elegantly eliminated. Tens of millions of families bought it for exactly that reason, and it worked as described. The problem was structural and temporal. The hardware that made the rail slide degraded with use. Screws loosened. Plastic components wore. The tolerances that kept the lowered rail flush with the mattress opened up into gaps, and the gaps were sized with functional specificity for an infant's head. The Consumer Product Safety Commission linked dropside cribs to at least 32 infant deaths between 2000 and 2010. The United States banned their manufacture and sale in 2011. That ban applied to production. It did not travel retroactively into the attics, rental properties, daycares, and grandparent spare rooms where units manufactured before the standard continued to be used on children born after it. You are looking at a product whose primary design feature became progressively more dangerous the longer it remained in service, which is an unusual quality for something classified as safety furniture. 23. The baby walker has appeared in Western art since at least the late 15th century. A Hieronymus Bosch painting from approximately 1490 contains one, which means this device predates widespread literacy, the germ theory of disease, and every safety standard ever written, and has survived all of them. The universal belief attached to it is intuitive and mechanically plausible. An infant practicing movement in an upright position is practicing walking. The research disagreed. Studies found that walker use was associated with delayed independent walking and lower developmental assessment scores compared to infants who did not use them. The mechanism involves the walker substituting for the neuromuscular feedback loop, specifically the recruitment of hip extensors and ankle dorsiflexors, that builds the coordination required for unaided locomotion. The walker moves the infant without teaching the infant's body to move itself. Each month of use corresponded to approximately 3 days of delayed motor milestone achievement in the research examining this relationship. Canada banned the sale of baby walkers in 2004. The United States Consumer Product Safety Commission recorded over 200,000 walker-related emergency room visits in a single decade before mandatory safety standards arrived in 1997. The device's purpose was to help babies walk sooner. Its documented effect was helping them walk later. 24. The window cage deserves to be examined not as evidence of Victorian cruelty, but as evidence of Victorian problem solving applied without the safety architecture that would have made it less alarming. Urban apartments in the 1920s had no balconies, no gardens, and no outdoor space, and the medical consensus of the era held that fresh air and sunlight were essential components of infant health, a position that was not wrong. The Baby Cage Company produced a patented solution, a wire mesh enclosure bolted to the exterior of the apartment window, in which the infant could be placed to receive the prescribed outdoor exposure without the family possessing any outdoor space. Eleanor Roosevelt reportedly used one. The design was secured to the window frame with basic hooks. There was no load rating specification for the bracket. There was no minimum building height restriction. There was no secondary restraint inside the cage. The entire engineering case for the device rested on the assumption that the hook would hold under the weight of an infant, and that nothing, a bird, a gust of wind, a passing vibration, would interfere with that assumption for the duration of the outdoor exposure. The problem was real. The solution was a wire box over a multi-story drop, and the hook was doing all the work. 25. Feeding an infant directly from a goat was not a folk remedy practiced in isolated rural communities. It was a medical recommendation implemented in urban institutional settings with professional oversight. French foundling hospitals in the 1770s through early 1800s maintained herds of goats specifically for this purpose, based on the physician assessment that goat milk's composition was gentler on infant digestion than cow's milk and more consistent than human wet nurses. The infants were placed at the goat's teat and fed directly. No one was controlling for the bacterial content of the animal's milk. No one was controlling for the hygiene of the animal's body. No one was assessing feeding position relative to aspiration risk, or the consistency of milk flow, or the infant's ability to manage the volume. Germ theory had not yet arrived to organize these concerns into a framework. The infant mortality rate at institutions using this method remained catastrophically high, which contemporaries attributed to the fragility of foundling infants rather than to the feeding protocol. The medical rationale was genuine. The outcome data was available. The gap between those two things, the confident professional recommendation and the bodies in the mortality record, was bridged by the absence of a framework for asking whether the recommendation was causing the outcome. 26. The baby cage was patented. The feeding boat was sold in apothecaries. The opium syrup was advertised in newspapers, and the mechanical rocking cradle with no motion standard was manufactured by companies with names and addresses and order forms. These were not fringe products discovered in someone's attic. They were the mainstream consumer market of their era, and the people who bought them were not neglectful. They were following the guidance available to them with the information architecture that existed. What the era lacked was not concern for infants. It was a Consumer Product Safety Commission, a mandatory testing protocol, a peer-reviewed injury surveillance system, and the regulatory framework that requires a product to demonstrate safety before it reaches the shelf rather than accumulating a body count until a recall is issued. The modern equivalent of every item on this list is sitting in a retail store right now, and the difference between it and the items that will appear on a list like this one in 50 years is not that the current products are definitely safe. It is that the testing has been done to the standards currently available. The standards improve when the data arrives. The data arrives after the product has been in homes. That sequence has not changed. 27 tightly bound infant skulls were a deliberate outcome in dozens of cultures across 5 continents, achieved through the application of boards, wrappings, or shape devices to newborn heads in the first weeks of life, when the skull plates are softest and growth is fastest. The desired shapes varied by culture, elongated in pre-Columbian South America, flattened frontally in certain Pacific Island communities, shaped to signify lineage or status in others. The practice was widespread enough to be documented in ancient Egypt, among the Huns, in Melanesian communities, and in cultures that had no contact with each other, suggesting the impulse to reshape infant skulls for social and aesthetic purposes is not culturally specific. Most researchers find no evidence of cognitive impairment in typical historical cases where the modification was moderate. The risk was in the variance. Applied incorrectly, sustained pressure on the developing skull increases intracranial pressure. Without a standardized application method, without measurement, without any means of assessing the outcome short of observation, the margin between the intended decorative modification and a harmful compression was entirely in the hands of whoever was applying the binding. The skull was soft for a developmental reason. The reason was not consulted before the binding was applied. 28, the pre-standard doorframe baby jumper, was a hook and wood and a fabric loop, and the entire weight-bearing engineering of the system was that combination. The hook went into the doorframe header, a piece of structural timber whose species, density, grain orientation, and moisture content varied by building, age, and whoever had originally framed the house. The fabric loop was sewn by someone, somewhere, at a tension and stitch density that was never independently tested, and the load the system was expected to carry was not a static weight. It was a dynamic load, an infant bouncing repeatedly, generating impact force with each downward movement that a structural engineer would estimate at 3 to 5 times the infant's resting weight per bounce. The American Society for Testing and Materials Standard for Baby Jumpers, ASTM F2088, was not finalized until 2007. Before that date, no third-party standard governed mounting hardware integrity, harness load rating, or attachment strength for any doorframe jumper product sold in the United States. What existed instead was the optimism of whoever installed the hook and the assumption that the doorframe was up to something it had never been tested for. The bouncing was enthusiastic. The engineering review arrived later. In that order, 29, talcum powder as a diaper change standard, came with a ritual that described its hazard in real time. You shook the container over the infant, producing a visible cloud of fine particles that settled over the diaper area, the infant's hands, the infant's face, and the ambient air of the enclosed space in which the change was happening. Infants breathe at 30 to 60 times per minute, significantly faster than adults, meaning they move proportionally more air per unit of body weight per hour than any adult in the same room. Talc particles fall within the respirable size range, between 1 and 10 microns, which means they travel into the lower airways rather than being filtered in the upper respiratory tract. The American Academy of Pediatrics first issued guidance against talcum powder for infants citing inhalation risk in the 1980s. The product remained in common use well beyond that date because the guidance was not delivered at the point of purchase. A cornstarch-based alternative existed throughout the talcum powder era and required only a raw material change and a different label. The product's entire mechanism, producing a fine dry cloud over a change area, is also a precise description of its primary documented risk. Both were visible at the same moment. One of them was on the label. 30, the jolly jumper, the door frame bouncer, the spring suspended seat, whatever the era called it, the product existed before anyone had formally specified what its failure mode looked like. Harness failure in a suspended infant device produces a fall from whatever height the device is hung at onto whatever surface exists below, with no deceleration between the suspension point and the floor. Pre-standard harness designs used basic fabric loops or simple sewn straps. Sewn strap integrity depends on thread type, stitch density, fabric weave, and the load history of the seam, variables that are not visible during inspection and degrade over a product's service life in ways the parent using it cannot assess. The Canadian toy safety standard specifically targeting jumper harness integrity was not finalized until 2007, well after doorframe jumpers had been sold for decades as mainstream infant entertainment products. Orthopedic concerns about hip joint development in jumpers used before an infant can support their own head were not codified into usage age labeling requirements until mandatory labeling enforcement arrived. Emergency room data shows the injuries from these products are consistent with harness failure and tip-over events rather than misuse, meaning the product design, not the parent's behavior, was the primary variable. The safety review came after the product did. 31. The pre-1973 crib was beautiful in the way that things built before anyone was measuring the gap between the slats could be beautiful. Elaborate turned spindles, decorative spacing, craftsmanship applied to aesthetics rather than to any defined structural safety parameter. The slat spacing on antique and vintage cribs frequently reached 4 inches. 4 inches allows an infant's body to pass through while the head cannot follow. The mechanism for entrapment is the body's weight pulling downward against a head that is fixed between 2 slats, a geometry that produces strangulation. The Consumer Product Safety Commission's 1973 crib safety standard established the maximum allowable slat spacing at 2 3/8 inches, derived from anthropometric data on infant head circumference. That standard applied to new production. It did not remove the antique cribs that were already in homes, already being treated as heirloom furniture, already being passed between family members with the confidence that a well-made, solid, expensive piece of furniture must also be a safe one. The CPSC continues to issue warnings against using cribs manufactured before 1973, specifically because the slat spacing issue cannot be assessed through visual inspection by an untrained eye. The crib was built to last generations. That is precisely how long the problem lasted with it. 32. The toy chest with a heavy lid was sold as a tidiness solution, a character-building exercise in putting things away, and a storage staple that any well-organized nursery or playroom contained. The lid was heavy because solid wood is heavy, and solid wood construction was the signal of quality. The hinge held the lid in one of 2 positions, open or closed. There was no intermediate stay mechanism. There was no interior handle. There was no ventilation provision in the event that the lid closed with a child inside. The Consumer Product Safety Commission identified toy chest lid entrapment as a significant child hazard in the 1970s, documenting the primary mechanisms: lid fall crush injuries to fingers, neck, and head during normal use, and asphyxiation from air depletion in a sealed chest when a child climbed inside and the lid fell shut. ASTM F963, the toy safety standard, now requires that toy chests either have no lid, a lightweight lid, a lid support mechanism that holds at any angle, or ventilation if fully enclosed. These requirements apply retroactively to 0 antique toy chests, currently in use as children's storage in homes where they were inherited as family pieces. The chest was built to last. The safety standard arrived later and stayed outside. 33. The high chair without a crotch restraint fails by a mechanism that has a name: submarining. When a high chair restraint system consists only of a waist belt without a vertical crotch post between the legs, an infant who slides forward in the seat passes under the tray rather than being stopped by it. The tray is not a restraint, it is a surface. As the infant's body slides forward and down, the waist belt rises to chest height, then throat height, as the infant's weight pulls against it from below. The CPSC documented deaths from this mechanism in high chairs using waist-only restraint systems. The structural fix was a fixed or snap-in crotch post that prevents forward slide by providing a physical barrier between the infant's legs. It added minimal manufacturing cost. Its absence from decades of high chair production was a design oversight, not a cost trade-off. No one had modeled the forward slide scenario. ASTM's high chair standard, requiring crotch restraint as a mandatory design element, was implemented in the late 20th century. Many vintage and imported high chairs without crotch posts remained in use in homes and restaurants after that date because the standard applied to new products, not to existing inventory already in service at family dining tables. 34. The pressure-mounted baby gate at the top of the staircase is a product installed with confidence by parents who read "baby gate" on the packaging and reasonably assumed it meant the same thing regardless of installation location. The packaging disagreed, in fine print, at the bottom, after the product had been purchased. Pressure-mounted gates hold position by outward tension against two parallel surfaces. They stay in place because the expanding mechanism pushes outward against the walls. A toddler falling or pushing against the gate applies force inward, which is precisely the direction that releases the tension. The failure mechanism is activated by the exact load the gate is installed to stop. Hardware-mounted gates, which are drilled into wall studs, resist inward force through mechanical attachment and are the only gate type recommended for top-of-stair installation by every relevant safety authority. The CPSC and gate manufacturers both specify not for use at the top of stairs on pressure-mounted products. This information is present on the box. It is not present in the product name, the marketing imagery, the retail signage, or the conversation with whoever sold it to you. The gate failed not because the parent ignored the warning, but because the warning was located in the place least likely to be consulted before the gate was installed and the stairs were trusted. 35. The thin plastic dry cleaning bag, repurposed as a crib mattress cover, was a practical solution in the mid-20th century household economy. Waterproof, free, and already in the house. The logic was sound by the standards of the problem it addressed. The mattress needed protection from moisture, and the bag was waterproof. What the logic did not account for was the physics of a thin, conforming film in contact with an infant's face during sleep. Dry cleaning polythene bags have a film thickness of approximately 0.5 mil to 1 mil, thin enough to conform entirely to facial contours with each breath cycle, creating a sealed surface rather than a rigid one that would maintain an air gap. The Consumer Product Safety Commission began warning against this specific practice by the 1960s. The bags themselves were subsequently required to carry warnings stating, "Keep away from children," which represented the regulatory conclusion that the mattress cover repurposing was a documented cause of infant death. Proper waterproof crib mattress covers, thick, firm, and fitted, are a categorically different product. The critical variable is conformability, whether the material shapes to a face or maintains its own structure against pressure. The frugal substitution did not recognize that distinction. The difference between the two products was approximately 1 millimeter of plastic thickness and a fatality rate. 36. The crib bumper pad was sold as a safety product. That is the detail worth sitting with. It was not sold as a decorative item that happened to be placed in the crib. It was positioned, marketed, and purchased specifically to protect an infant from harm. From bumping their head on crib slats, from catching a limb in the gaps between them. It was safety packaging for the sleep space. A study published in Pediatrics examining Consumer Product Safety Commission data identified 113 infant deaths attributable to crib bumpers between 1990 and 2019. The American Academy of Pediatrics specifically lists crib bumpers among the objects that should not be present in an infant's sleep environment, on the grounds that they are soft objects in a space from which all soft objects must be excluded. Illinois banned bumper sales in 2011. The Federal Consumer Product Safety Commission issued a rule banning padded crib bumpers nationally, effective 2023. The original justification for bumpers, preventing limb entrapment in slat gaps, was rendered unnecessary by the 1973 slat spacing standard, which required gaps narrow enough to prevent that entrapment. Bumpers continued to be sold for 50 years after the problem they claimed to solve had been legislated away inside the safety standard's primary exclusion zone as a safety product. 37 lead toy soldiers were premium products. They were detailed, durable, and sold specifically to children. British manufacturer Britain's Limited produced them commercially from 1893 onward. The material selected for these toys, cast lead, was chosen for its ability to hold fine detail in the casting process, its weight, and its durability. It was excellent for those purposes. The selection process did not consult the behavior of the intended user, which in the case of a toddler is mouthing. Hand-to-mouth behavior is not a misuse pattern in young children. It is the primary mode of sensory exploration for a developmental period that spans the first 2 to 3 years of life. Lead has no safe blood level in children, according to the Centers for Disease Control, meaning any detectable amount produces measurable neurological impact. The toys were in the hands of children who were putting them in their mouths for the duration of that exposure window. Lead paint on wooden nursery toys operates through the same pathway. Chewing on a painted surface delivers oral lead exposure directly and repeatedly. The Consumer Product Safety Commission banned lead paint in toys in 1978 in the United States. Recalls of imported toys with lead paint violations continued occurring decades after that date, which indicates the supply chain problem outlasted the regulatory year by a significant margin. 38. The wicker bassinet without a structural standard was not the wicker bassinet sold to you last year in a boutique with a JPMA certification sticker. It was everything sold before 2003, when the American Society for Testing and Materials published the first voluntary standard for bassinet safety in the United States. Before that publication, no federal regulation governed bassinet structural integrity, stand stability, or mattress to basket fit. The mattress fit gap is not an abstract concern. When a gap exists between the mattress edge and the interior wall of the basket, an infant who rolls against that wall can wedge their face into the space. The surface in that gap is soft and conforming. There is no rigid edge to push against, and the infant does not have the motor control to self-rescue from a face-down position against a yielding surface. The stand joint in a wicker design, the connection between the basket and its supporting frame, relies on the tension of the weave, which degrades with moisture and weight cycling over time. Stand failure with an infant inside produces a fall from sleeping height with no warning. The Consumer Product Safety Commission issued a mandatory updated bassinet rule in 2020 after injury data showed the category was still generating emergency room visits well after voluntary standards had been in place for years. 39. The belly sleep recommendation was not a cultural holdover or a regional folk practice. It was official pediatric guidance, actively promoted in the United States from roughly the 1950s through the early 1990s, based on the medical reasoning that a face-down infant would be less likely to aspirate vomit. The reasoning was intuitive, mechanically plausible, and wrong in the direction that mattered most. The American Academy of Pediatrics launched its Back to Sleep campaign in 1992. In the decade following that single recommendation reversal, the sudden infant death syndrome rate in the United States dropped by more than 50%. That is not a small effect. It is one of the largest single intervention reductions in infant mortality achieved in modern pediatric history, and it was achieved by reversing a recommendation that the medical establishment had been confidently issuing for approximately 40 years. New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and Australia launched equivalent campaigns and recorded comparable mortality reductions. The mechanism linking prone infant sleep to sudden infant death syndrome involves impaired arousal response, carbon dioxide rebreathing in the sleep microenvironment, and upper airway dynamics in the face-down position. But the evidence was the death rate, not the mechanism, and the death rate was available the entire time the recommendation was in place. 40. The crib gem strung across the interior of a crib was a developmental enrichment product. That was its category, its marketing, and its purpose: to provide visual tracking practice, tactile stimulation, and motor engagement for the infant lying below it. It worked for that purpose. It worked until the infant developed the motor capacity to push up on hands and knees, a milestone that typically arrives around 5 months, at which point the cord suspended across the crib at neck height, over an enclosed space occupied by an infant who could now reach it, became a strangulation mechanism with a developmental delay fuse. The Consumer Product Safety Commission identified this failure mode and issued guidance stating that suspended crib toys should be removed when the infant can push up on hands and knees, or at 5 months, whichever comes first. The problem was that many products were packaged and marketed throughout the infant's entire first year without a visible age removal instruction. The product stimulated development so effectively that the infant eventually developed past the point at which the product was safe, and the packaging had not planned for that trajectory. A cord at neck height in an enclosed space, suspended over a now mobile infant. The toy was doing its job. Its job had an expiration date that was not on the label. 41. The unsecured dresser in the nursery is not a vintage hazard or a discontinued product category. It is in the room right now in a significant percentage of homes with young children, positioned against a wall, fully loaded with folded clothing, and understood to be stable because it is heavy, and because heavy things generally stay where you put them. The stability assumption is correct against most forces. It is incorrect against the specific force a toddler applies, which is an outward and downward pull on an open drawer at approximately the height of the toddler's chest. That force applied to a tall, narrow dresser at drawer height is a mechanically efficient tip-over load. The Consumer Product Safety Commission's data shows a child is killed by tip-over furniture or televisions every 2 weeks in the United States. Wall anchoring kits cost a few dollars and attach a furniture strap from the dresser's upper back rail to a wall stud. The barrier to installing them is not cost. It is the belief that the dresser's weight makes it stable against a toddler's pull, a belief that the physics of the tip-over load does not support. ASTM F2057, the Clothing Storage Unit Stability Standard, became mandatory under a CPSC rule in 2023. Every dresser sold before that date may not meet it, and the ones that don't look exactly like the ones that do. 42. The infant incubator's history in the United States is not a story about medical technology. It is a story about institutional priorities, and it begins with a carnival. Martin County operated paid admission sideshow exhibitions featuring premature infants in working incubators at Coney Island and at World's Fairs from 1896 through 1943. The admission charge from the viewing public funded the equipment, the nursing staff, and the medical care. Families paid nothing. Spectators paid to look. The reason this arrangement existed was not that Cooney was an exhibitionist. It was that American hospitals of the era considered premature infant survival a low probability, low priority investment, and declined to fund incubators. Cooney's operation saved an estimated 6,500 premature infants over the course of his career. His survival rates were comparable to, or better than, the hospital outcomes of the same period. The most advanced neonatal care available in the United States was located in an amusement park, between other attractions, for nearly 50 years, because the medical institutions that should have funded it had assessed the return on investment and passed. Hospitals absorbed the incubator into standard neonatal care in the 1940s. The technology did not change. The funding calculus changed. The carnival closed. 43. Arsenic in the nursery wallpaper was not arsenic applied carelessly or maliciously. It was the byproduct of making the most fashionable color of the Victorian interior using the best pigment technology available at the time. Sheila's green, copper arsenite, produced the vivid botanical greens that appeared in nursery papers, chosen specifically to be stimulating and beautiful for the infant who would spend their early months staring at those walls. Chemists knew the pigment contained arsenic. The domestic risk debate was conducted largely to the satisfaction of the wallpaper industry. What the debate did not model was the biological mechanism. A mold called Scopulariopsis brevicalis grows in the starch-based paste of damp Victorian walls and metabolizes arsenic from the pigment into trimethylarsine, a volatile, odorless gas. Nurseries were small, poorly ventilated, humid from infant respiration, and the occupants slept at the level closest to the wall, where gas concentrations were highest. The exposure pathway was real and chemically documented. Some historians have proposed it as a contributing variable in historical unexplained infant deaths, a hypothesis that is unproven but not unreasonable given the mechanism. The wallpaper was selected to delight the infant. The chemistry problem was invisible, odorless, and operating continuously in the room where the infant slept. 44. The toy chest in the playroom and the wooden blanket chest in the bedroom, repurposed as toy storage and handed down as a family piece, share one design feature that no antique version ever addressed: the lid. It is heavy because solid construction reads as quality. It opens in one of two positions, up or down. It has no intermediate stay mechanism, no interior release handle, and no ventilation. A child climbing inside to hide during a game, or leaning in to retrieve a toy from the bottom and pulling the lid shut, or having it fall shut, is in an enclosed, unventilated space with a heavy lid they cannot lift from the inside. The Consumer Product Safety Commission documented this specific hazard in the 1970s. ASTM F963 now requires toy chests to meet one of 4 design criteria: no lid, a lightweight lid, a lid support that holds at any angle, or ventilation adequate for an enclosed occupant. These requirements do not travel backward through time to antique cedar chests, blanket boxes, or inherited wooden storage pieces currently in use as toy storage in living rooms and children's bedrooms. They fail every element of the modern standard. They look like quality heirloom furniture, which is why the conversation about replacing them with something that passes a basic safety review is one that most families never have. 45. The belly sleep recommendation failed 50 years of infants before a single intervention reversed it. The crib bumper was sold as a safety product for decades after its primary hazard was documented. The dropside crib stayed in production until 2011. These were not fringe products in marginal use. They were mainstream recommendations, dominant retail categories, and the confident advice of physicians, pediatricians, and parenting authorities across multiple generations. The pattern they share is the same pattern that runs through every item on this list. The product or recommendation solved a visible problem, generated confidence, and accumulated a separate body of evidence that arrived after the adoption curve had already peaked. You were not failed by negligent parents or bad actors. You were failed by a system in which the evidence follows the product rather than preceding it, and in which the update to the recommendation travels more slowly than the original recommendation did. The Consumer Product Safety Commission, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the Voluntary Standard System are the infrastructure built specifically to shorten the gap between the harm and the correction. They work imperfectly, they work slowly, and the sequence, product first, evidence second, correction third, has not fundamentally changed. The only variable you control is how quickly you update when the correction arrives. 46. The pre-standard bouncy seat placed on a kitchen counter was used by parents who were following a completely rational logic. The infant needed to be at a height where the parent could see them. The seat was designed to hold the infant, and the counter was flat. The floor of this reasoning collapsed at the point where the seat's primary function, responding to infant movement with motion, became its primary hazard on an elevated surface. Bouncy seats move. They vibrate when motorized, they shift with infant weight transfers, and they drift toward whatever edge exists downhill from their starting position with each movement cycle. A counter is 36 inches from the floor. An infant in a bouncy seat at 36 inches above a hard floor, falling to that floor, can sustain skull fractures. The Consumer Product Safety Commission records thousands of emergency room visits annually from this mechanism. The packaging instructions typically specify floor-only use. This information was present on the product and not in the retail environment. The gift registry, or any conversation the parent had about the seat before the counter, became the chosen surface. The infant demonstrated Newton's first law at a timeline that matched precisely how long the adult's attention was on something else, which is a measurement that has never been zero. 47. The high chair without a crotch restraint allowed an infant to submarine, to slide forward under the tray, converting a lap-level restraint into a throat-level one, and the fix was a crotch post, which is a vertical bar between the infant's legs that prevents forward slide by simple mechanical obstruction. The absence of this bar from decades of high chair production was not a cost calculation. It was a design blind spot. No one had modeled the forward slide as the failure scenario because the tray appeared to be in the way, and the tray was not a restraint. The Consumer Product Safety Commission documented deaths from this mechanism. The crotch post was added to ASTM high chair standards as a mandatory requirement. Vintage wooden high chairs, the kind sold at estate sales, passed down by grandparents, or sourced from secondhand markets for their aesthetic appeal and obvious solid wood construction quality, predate this requirement. They have waist belts occasionally. They do not have crotch posts. They tip at angles narrower than modern standards permit because their base dimensions were determined by furniture conventions rather than stability testing protocols. They are genuinely beautiful and genuinely non-compliant with every safety requirement written after they were built, and they are still in use in homes where no one has compared the product to the standard. 48. The amber teething necklace was sold in natural parenting shops alongside organic cotton swaddles and non-toxic wooden toys, positioned as the gentle, evidence-based alternative to pharmaceutical teething relief. The proposed mechanism, succinic acid from warmed Baltic amber migrating transdermally into the infant's bloodstream and producing anti-inflammatory relief, has not been demonstrated in any peer-reviewed clinical study. The amount of succinic acid that could migrate from a polished amber bead to skin at body temperature is pharmacologically negligible by the measures used to assess transdermal drug delivery. That is the efficacy problem. The safety problem is a necklace around the neck of an infant, with beads that can detach and enter an airway sized for exactly that bead diameter, in a product worn during the developmental period when mouthing is the primary mode of engagement with any object within reach. The Food and Drug Administration and the American Academy of Pediatrics have both issued warnings against amber teething necklaces, citing strangulation and choking risk. Australia's Competition and Consumer Commission recorded infant fatalities attributed to the product. Brake-release safety mechanisms, marketed as mitigating the strangulation risk, were tested and found inconsistently effective under realistic infant movement and entanglement scenarios. The necklace was natural. The hazard profile was not reduced by the sourcing. 49. The pacifier cord that was long enough to reach the infant's mouth was long enough to reach the infant's neck. That sentence does not require elaboration, but the regulatory history suggests it required documentation, because the Consumer Product Safety Commission recorded strangulation deaths from pacifier cords before issuing the standards that address them. Pre-standard pacifier holders were sold with ribbon lengths of 12 to 18 inches, aesthetically proportional to adult sensibilities about what a decorative cord should look like, and functionally dangerous for an infant whose neck circumference makes a 12-inch cord a workable noose under the right rotational conditions during sleep. CPSC guidelines now specify that pacifier holders must have cords no longer than 6 inches. ASTM, F963, and CPSC regulations additionally specify minimum clasp strength, sufficient to prevent the clip from attaching to crib slats, which is the scenario that converts a loose cord into a fixed anchor with the infant's weight on it. These standards were written after the deaths that made them necessary, which is the standard sequence. The cord was designed to reach the mouth. Whether anyone measured the distance from the mouth to the neck before setting the ribbon length is answered by the existence of a maximum length standard that arrived later and was not 0. 50. The inherited bicycle helmet in the garage. The one that has never been in a crash. The one that looks perfectly fine. The one you are planning to put on the child's head because it is a helmet, and helmets protect heads, may have already consumed its protective service life on a shelf. Expanded polystyrene foam. The energy-absorbing material inside the shell degrades through ultraviolet exposure, sweat absorption, and material aging regardless of impact history. The CPSC and helmet manufacturers recommend replacement every 5 years, regardless of use, and immediately after any significant impact. An impact that compressed the foam, even one that appeared minor, even one that left the outer shell visually intact, has permanently reduced the foam's energy-absorbing capacity at that location. The shell's function is to distribute impact force across the foam. The foam's function is to absorb it. The shell can be structurally intact and visually indistinguishable from new, while the foam beneath it has been compromised in a way that no visual inspection can detect without cutting it open. Helmet standards test new helmets. There is no assessment protocol for used helmet protective capacity available to a parent in a garage. The helmet looked fine. Looking fine is not the same as passing a test. 51. The Carnival was the neonatal intensive care unit. That is not a metaphor or a compression for rhetorical effect. From 1896 through 1943, the primary location in the United States where premature infants received incubator care was a paid admission sideshow exhibition at Coney Island, operated by Martin County, funded entirely by the admission fees of spectators. Families paid nothing. The public paid to look at the infants, and the revenue from that arrangement funded the equipment, the round-the-clock nursing staff, and the medical oversight that kept approximately 6,500 premature infants alive over the course of Cooney's career. American hospitals declined to fund incubators during this period because the medical assessment was that premature infant survival was a low-probability investment, not worth the institutional resources. Cooney's survival rates were comparable to, or better than, the hospital outcomes of the same era, achieved in a building located between other carnival attractions, because the technology worked and the hospitals had decided not to use it. The incubator moved into standard hospital neonatal care in the 1940s. The technology did not change. The funding decision changed. For the 50 years before that decision was made, the most sophisticated premature infant care in the country had a ticket price and an admission line, and the medical establishment was somewhere else. 52. the controlled crying debate has generated more parenting culture conflict than almost any other topic in modern infant care. And the version of it that caused the most damage was not the graduated extinction method that involves parental check-ins on a schedule. It was the earlier, more aggressive prescription from behaviorist John B. Watson in the 1920s, which recommended no physical affection, no picking up in response to crying, and strictly scheduled interaction. A program designed to produce independent, emotionally self-sufficient children by systematically withholding caregiver response to infant distress signals. The cortisol research conducted decades later found something that complicated the "it doesn't hurt them" assurance. Even after an infant stops crying through behavioral extinction, meaning they have stopped signaling, their measured stress hormone levels in some studies remained elevated. The infant learned to stop communicating distress. They did not learn to stop experiencing it. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby from the 1950s onward and supported by decades of subsequent research, establishes consistent caregiver responsiveness to infant distress as a developmental foundation, not a spoiling mechanism. The confidence with which the opposite was prescribed by credentialed researchers in published guidance to millions of parents was not matched by the stress hormone data, which arrived later and pointed in a different direction. 53, the rocking horse with bow rockers, the kind that sits on curved wooden runners on the floor, was the version that preceded the safety stand, and the reason the safety stand exists is written into the name of its replacement. 19th century rocking horses used runners that contacted the floor in a curved arc. An enthusiastic rocking could move that arc across the floor progressively, walking the entire horse toward whatever wall, stair edge, or furniture leg existed in the trajectory. The horse could also eject a rider who leaned too far forward or backward because the seat had no restraint and the rocking momentum had a direction. The replacement product was called the safety stand, a spring-suspended horse on a fixed frame, and it was marketed specifically as the safer alternative, which means the industry acknowledged the original design had a safety problem at the moment it introduced the solution. No fall clearance zone, restraint system, or maximum rocking arc standard existed before the safety stand era because no one had created the regulatory framework to require those measurements. A traditional carved wooden rocking horse weighs between 30 and 80 pounds. When it tips, the horse comes with the child, which is a different outcome than a fall from the same height without 80 pounds of carved wood in the same direction. 54, the pudding cap was the original infant head protection technology. A fabric ring stuffed with padding, worn around the crown of a toddler's head to absorb impact during the learning to walk phase. It appears in historical records and portraiture from at least the 16th century. It was a genuine attempt at impact attenuation for a genuine problem, and the attempt was made with the materials and the understanding available. What those materials could not do was pass a modern impact attenuation test, because stuffed fabric does not attenuate impact in a mechanically meaningful way. It protects the scalp against surface abrasion from a direct crown contact. It provides essentially no protection at the temporal or frontal impact sites, which are the more common injury locations in a toddler forward fall, because those are not the locations the ring covered. Modern infant and toddler helmet testing standards, where they exist, specify impact, velocity, impact, location, and deceleration threshold. Stuffed fabric fails those parameters at the first measurement. By the Georgian era, the pudding cap appeared primarily as a fashion element in portraiture, a style detail on toddlers that had outlived its nominal protective function and become decorative. Generations of parents believed they had solved the toddler fall problem. The fabric ring was the solution, and the solution had never been tested. 55. Leaving a sleeping infant in a parked car during a brief errand was a parenting judgment call that failed on the physics before it failed on the law. A car's internal temperature rises approximately 19 degrees Fahrenheit in the first 10 minutes when parked in sunlight. The ambient temperature on a moderately warm day is not the variable that determines how dangerous the interior becomes, because solar radiation through glass is the primary heat source, not convection from outside air. Cracking the windows has been tested and found to have negligible effect on the rate of temperature rise for exactly this reason. An infant's core temperature rises 3 to 5 times faster than an adult's in the same thermal environment, because infant thermoregulatory capacity, the sweat response, the cardiovascular compensation, is significantly less developed. The United States averages approximately 37 pediatric vehicular heat stroke deaths annually. The majority involve caregivers who did not intend to leave the child for long. The errand was going to take 5 minutes. The car had already started its thermal trajectory before the door closed. The 5-minute estimate was a human judgment applied to a physics process that does not negotiate with estimates, and the car's internal temperature was on its own schedule from the moment it was parked. 56. The crib bumper's regulatory history is a useful case study in how a product category can persist inside a safety standards exclusion zone for decades while continuing to be sold as the safety category it was excluded from. The 1973 slat spacing standard established 2 3/8 inches as the maximum allowable gap between crib slats, derived from infant head circumference measurements. That standard eliminated the limb entrapment problem that crib bumpers were designed to prevent. Bumpers continued to be sold for 50 years after that date, in cribs that already met the slat spacing standard, in a sleep environment from which the American Academy of Pediatrics specifically excludes all soft objects. A study published in Pediatrics identified 113 infant deaths attributable to crib bumpers between 1990 and 2019. Illinois banned bumper sales in 2011. Maryland and Ohio followed. The Federal Consumer Product Safety Commission rule banning padded crib bumpers took effect in 2023. The product solved a problem that had been regulated away in 1973, introduced a suffocation and strangulation risk that was documented in the mortality record, and remained in retail sale for half a century in between. It was purchased by parents who read the word safety and reasonably assumed the product had cleared the standard that word implies. 57. Painting the nursery in the final weeks before the baby arrives is one of the most universal nesting behaviors, and it schedules the peak chemical off-gassing event of the freshly painted room to coincide precisely with the arrival of the occupant who has the least capacity to ventilate it. Volatile organic compound emissions from interior paint follow a biphasic curve. The highest emission rate occurs in the first 24 to 72 hours after application, followed by a slower off-gassing period that can continue for weeks to months. Infants breathe at 30 to 60 times per minute, significantly faster than adults, meaning they process proportionally more air per unit of body weight per hour, and therefore proportionally more of any compound present in that air. Low VOC and zero VOC paint designations exist and address the base paint formulation. They do not account for the colorants added at the point of sale, which introduce additional volatile compounds not reflected in the base label rating. The practical guidance from indoor air quality researchers is to paint at least 2 to 3 weeks before nursery occupancy and ventilate aggressively during and after application. The cultural norm of completing the nursery immediately before the due date schedules the highest emission window to overlap with the first weeks of the infant's life in that room, which is the worst available timing by the chemistry. 58. The playpen used as a full-day containment solution solved a real problem for the adult and introduced a different problem for the infant's developing nervous system. Motor development research establishes that floor-based free movement, rolling, reaching, transitioning from position to position, navigating a varied surface, provides the proprioceptive and neuromuscular input that builds the coordination underlying both motor and cognitive development. An infant spending the majority of their waking hours in a small, flat-bottomed enclosure is not receiving that input. They are in a sensory environment with a fixed boundary, a uniform surface, and a limited range of achievable movement. The extreme version of this deprivation model comes from Romanian orphanage research, where infants confined to cribs for extended periods showed severe and lasting motor and cognitive developmental delays. The playpen is not an orphanage, and the exposure is not equivalent. The principle that passive containment does not substitute for active environmental exploration during the developmental window when the brain is specifically configured to receive environmental input is the same. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends interactive play, and floor time specifically, and advises limiting time in bouncers, swings, and playpens. The mid-20th century parenting literature that promoted the playpen as a safe, full-day solution was optimizing for adult productivity during a window when the infant's developmental needs pointed in the opposite direction. 59. The fontanelle, the soft spot on a newborn's head, was communicated to new parents with such alarm that many of them stopped using it as the diagnostic tool it actually is. The fontanelle is not exposed brain tissue. It is not an open wound. It is covered by a tough, fibrous membrane, and routine gentle contact does not damage it. What the fontanelle is, functionally, is the most accessible real-time physiological indicator on the infant's body. A bulging fontanelle indicates elevated intracranial pressure, meningitis, hydrocephalus, or other conditions requiring immediate intervention. A sunken fontanelle indicates dehydration. Both are visible and accessible through observation and gentle palpation by a caregiver who has been told that looking at and touching the soft spot is dangerous. The excessive alarm surrounding the fontanelle causes caregivers to avoid examining it, which means the built-in warning system the infant's body provides goes unmonitored during the period when it is most clinically relevant. It also causes avoidance of routine scalp care in the area, leading to cradle cap accumulation that is then more difficult to treat. The fontanelle closes between 12 and 18 months as the skull plates fuse. The timing of closure is itself a clinical data point. The alarm that prevented parents from looking at it also prevented them from noticing when it was telling them something. 60. Thalidomide was prescribed to pregnant women as a safe, mild sedative, specifically recommended as appropriate during pregnancy for sleep difficulty and morning sickness, based on studies that had established it was not acutely toxic in the doses tested. The studies had not tested it in pregnant animals. That specific gap in the safety data was the gap through which approximately 10,000 infants entered the world with severe limb malformations in 46 countries where the drug was licensed and distributed from 1957 onward. The drug crosses the placental barrier and interferes with limb formation during a specific developmental window, days 20 through 36 after conception, when the limb buds are forming. A single dose during that window was sufficient to cause phocomelia, a condition involving the absence or severe shortening of limbs. In the United States, Food and Drug Administration pharmacologist Frances Kelsey blocked approval in 1960 because the application lacked sufficient safety data, a decision that made her professionally unpopular at the time and prevented a domestic epidemic. The thalidomide disaster produced the 1962 Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which established the requirement that drugs demonstrate both safety and efficacy before FDA approval. The regulatory framework the United States uses today for pharmaceutical approval was built from the wreckage of a drug that was safe in adults and catastrophic in the developmental window no one had tested. 61. Honey given to an infant under 12 months is not a nutritional risk or a general caution about sugar. It is a specific, documented cause of infant botulism, produced by a mechanism that is entirely predictable from infant gut physiology. Clostridium botulinum spores are present in honey globally at low but consistent rates. In an adult or a child over 12 months, these spores are harmless because the mature intestinal microbiome outcompetes them. Germination does not occur. No toxin is produced. In an infant under 12 months, the gut flora is immature and insufficiently competitive. The spores germinate in the infant intestine and produce botulinum toxin in place, a mechanism called intestinal toxemia that does not occur in older individuals. Symptoms begin with constipation and a weak cry, progress to flaccid paralysis, and can advance to respiratory failure. The United States records approximately 100 cases of infant botulism annually. The Food and Drug Administration and the American Academy of Pediatrics have recommended against honey for infants under 12 months since the 1970s. A recommendation based on a well-established mechanism that has not changed. Honey continued to appear as an ingredient in some commercial infant remedies and as a folk recommendation in family oral tradition because the recommendation against it traveled more slowly than the tradition did. 62. The mercury teething powder had a clinical name, a pharmacy shelf, and a pediatric dose printed on the label. Calomel mercurous chloride was the active ingredient in products like Steedman's soothing powders, used on infants across the United Kingdom, Australia, and elsewhere through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The condition it caused was named pink disease, or acrodynia, nerve damage, characteristic pink discoloration of the extremities, hair loss, and profound irritability. The causal link between calomel teething powders and pink disease was formally established by Dr. John Bivings in 1949. The powders had been in widespread use for decades before that publication. An estimated 1 in 500 exposed infants developed acrodynia. Of those, approximately 10% died. United Kingdom sales collapsed after Bivings' research was published. Some countries continued selling calomel-containing infant products into the 1950s. The gap between the product reaching the market and the causal mechanism being formally identified was multiple decades, during which the powder remained on pharmacy shelves with pediatric dosing instructions, because the connection between the product and the condition it produced had not been formally drawn. The teething discomfort was addressed. The mechanism of that address was systemic heavy metal poisoning, which was not printed on the label next to the dosing instructions. 63. The doorframe baby gate installed at the top of the stairs with a pressure mount mechanism is a product whose primary structural principle, outward tension against two parallel surfaces, is released by the inward force it was installed to stop. That is not a subtle engineering flaw. It is a direct conflict between the load the product was designed to resist and the mechanism by which it holds position. Pressure-mounted gates are appropriate for bottom-of-stair installation and doorway use, where a toddler pushing through creates nuisance rather than a fall from height. At the top of a staircase, the gate's failure under the expected load produces a fall down the stairs, which is the outcome the gate was purchased to prevent. Hardware-mounted gates are drilled into wall studs and resist inward force through mechanical attachment rather than friction. Every relevant safety authority specifies hardware-mounted gates for top-of-stair use. This information appears on the packaging of pressure-mounted gates in the "Not for use at the top of stairs" warning. It does not appear in the product name, the retail display, the gift registry description, or the conversation at the hardware store checkout. The gate was purchased to solve the staircase problem. The mechanism by which it holds failed against the exact force the staircase problem generates, and the warning about that conflict was in the last place anyone looked. 64. The antique high chair at the family dining table is often described as solid, well-made, and built to last, which are accurate assessments of the craftsmanship and completely irrelevant to whether it meets any of the safety requirements written after it was manufactured. Vintage wooden high chairs predate ASTM F404, which requires a 5-point harness or equivalent restraint system, a crotch post, and a defined stability base. They have none of these. The tray functions as a lap bar, not a restraint. The stability base, the footprint relative to the seat height, was determined by furniture convention rather than tip-over testing. The waist belt, when present, allows the submarining scenario. An infant who slides forward exits below the tray while the belt rises to chest and then throat level. The chair's height above the floor was determined by adult dining table ergonomics, meaning the fall distance from seat to floor reflects the adult body rather than any pediatric fall injury calculation. The CPSC specifically advises against using antique or vintage high chairs for children. The advice does not reach the estate sale, the family storage unit, or the decision to bring the chair down from the attic for the grandchild's visit, because it was good enough for the parents. The chair was good enough for the parents in an era before the standard existed. 65. Gripe water has been passed from grandmother to mother to infant across generations, with the confidence that multi-generational use confers, which is the confidence of consistency rather than of evidence. The original Woodward's gripe water, formulated in 1851, contained 3.6% alcohol and sodium bicarbonate. Alcohol was removed from United Kingdom formulations in 1992 under regulatory pressure that arrived approximately 140 years after the product launched. Sodium bicarbonate in repeated doses can cause metabolic alkalosis in infants whose kidneys have limited bicarbonate clearance capacity, a vulnerability that differs categorically from the adult response to the same ingredient. Modern commercial gripe water formulations vary significantly by country and manufacturer. In the United States, the Food and Drug Administration classifies gripe water as a dietary supplement, meaning efficacy and safety data requirements are substantially lower than the pharmaceutical classification that would govern a drug making equivalent therapeutic claims. No randomized controlled trial evidence supports gripe water as effective for infant colic. The active botanical ingredients, dill oil, fennel, have not been demonstrated effective at the concentrations present in commercial products. The remedy has been used continuously for over 170 years. The clinical trial evidence for it has not arrived in that interval, which the multi-generational confidence does not reflect. 66. The home apnea monitor marketed as sudden infant death syndrome. Prevention technology was studied, and the study results were not what the marketing implied. The National Institutes of Health Collaborative Home Infant Monitoring evaluation, published in 2001, found no evidence that home cardiorespiratory monitoring prevented sudden infant death syndrome deaths. Infants who subsequently died of sudden infant death syndrome showed no detectable apnea events on their monitors before death, meaning the monitor was not capturing the physiological precursor it was positioned to detect and respond to. The American Academy of Pediatrics has explicitly stated that commercial monitors marketed as sudden infant death syndrome. Prevention are not proven to prevent sudden infant death syndrome. Home apnea monitoring was originally prescribed for a specific high-risk clinical population, infants with documented apnea of prematurity, and was subsequently marketed broadly to general consumer parents, a scope expansion that the clinical evidence did not support. The additional concern is monitor-induced false security. Parents who believe a device is preventing sudden infant death syndrome may make sleep environment choices they would not otherwise make because they believe the monitor compensates for the risk. The technology was real. The monitoring was real. The sudden infant death syndrome prevention was the part the clinical data did not confirm, which is a distinction the marketing did not emphasize. 67. The metal playground slide in full afternoon summer sun reaches surface temperatures sufficient to cause full-thickness burns on infant skin within seconds of contact, and this was not a design consideration for most of the metal slide era. Studies measuring playground surface temperatures have found that metal slides in direct sunlight reach between 160 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit during peak afternoon hours. Infant skin burns at a significantly lower contact temperature and contact duration than adult skin because the epidermis is thinner and heat transfer to the underlying tissue layers is faster. The regulatory testing framework for playground equipment, ASTM F1487, the standard for public use playground equipment, addresses structural integrity, entrapment hazards, fall surface requirements, and fall height. It does not specify maximum surface temperature as a pass-fail test parameter. Surface temperature guidance for playgrounds has remained advisory rather than mandatory, meaning the slide can meet every applicable standard and still be hot enough to burn the child who uses it during the hours those standards do not address. The slide was tested for the fall. The surface at operating temperature during the hours children were most likely to use it was a variable the standard framework left outside its scope, and the child at the bottom of the slide encountered it without any warning that the testing had not covered that part. 68. The formula preparation instruction that most parents received did not include the information that powdered infant formula is not sterile at the point of manufacture. Chronobacter sakazakii is an environmental pathogen that can survive in dry powder environments and has been detected in powdered infant formula manufacturing facilities and in consumer product samples. Neonatal Chronobacter infection carries a mortality rate of approximately 40 to 80%. The World Health Organization's preparation guidance recommends using water that has been boiled and cooled to no less than 70 degrees Celsius, 158 degrees Fahrenheit, which kills Chronobacter present in the dry formula powder. Most consumer preparation instructions printed on formula packaging do not specify a minimum water temperature. Parents who prepare formula with room temperature water, warm tap water, or water from a countertop filter are not following an incorrect instruction. They are following the instruction as written, which omits the kill step information. Liquid ready-to-feed formula is sterile as packaged and eliminates the Chronobacter preparation risk entirely. The 2022 Abbott formula recall involving Similac and other brands following Chronobacter contamination findings at the manufacturing facility made this gap visible to the public. Before that recall, the assumption of sterility in a sealed commercial tin was reasonable and wrong, and the preparation instruction did not correct it. 69. Introducing solid foods to a 4-week-old infant was not a fringe practice confined to uninformed households. It was actively encouraged by mainstream pediatric culture through the mid-20th century, with some published guidance recommending cereal introduction at 4 to 8 weeks of age. Mothers who introduced solids early were socially perceived as more competent, more attentive, and better at the job. The infant gut during those first weeks is not structurally or immunologically prepared to receive solid food by any measure available in the research that followed. Gut closure, the maturation of intestinal permeability that prevents large food molecules from crossing directly into the bloodstream, is a developmental process not complete until approximately 4 to 6 months. An infant at 4 weeks has insufficient amylase to digest starch, which is the primary component of cereal, the most commonly introduced early food. The immune sensitization risk associated with early solid introduction before gut closure has been linked to increased allergy development. The World Health Organization recommends exclusive breastfeeding to 6 months. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends introduction no earlier than 4 months. Both are reversals of guidance that was issued with comparable confidence in the opposite direction during the 1950s and 60s. The infant was congratulated for accepting food it could not process, and the gut filed its objections through the only communication channel it had. 70. The pressure-mounted baby gate at the top of the staircase has already appeared on this list, but the expandable version with the decorative pressure bar deserves its own entry because the failure mode is the same and the installation rate at staircases is high enough to warrant the repetition. The gate holds by pushing outward. A toddler falling into it pushes inward. The mechanism that holds the gate in position is released by the load the gate is installed to absorb, and the release produces a fall down the stairs, which is the outcome the gate was purchased to prevent. Hardware-mounted gates resist inward force through mechanical attachment to wall studs. The Consumer Product Safety Commission and every gate manufacturer specifies hardware mounting for top-of-stair installation. This appears on the packaging. It does not appear prominently in retail displays, product naming conventions, or gift registry descriptions, and it is not the information most parents receive when they purchase a gate at a hardware store. The gate category is labeled Baby Gate. Baby gates are understood to be for babies near stairs. The distinction between pressure-mounted and hardware-mounted is a subcategory detail that the category name does not communicate, and the staircase does not forgive the difference between the two installation methods. 71. The baby monitor marketed as sudden infant death syndrome. Prevention technology created a confidence that the clinical evidence did not support and that may have altered the sleep environment decisions of parents who believed the monitor was compensating for risk. This is a different problem from simply being ineffective. A monitor that provides no benefit is a waste of money. A monitor that provides no benefit while causing the parent to feel protected against a risk the monitor does not address can produce net negative outcomes if the perceived protection changes behavior. The National Institutes of Health study published in 2001 found no evidence that home cardiorespiratory monitoring prevented sudden infant death syndrome deaths. The American Academy of Pediatrics position has been explicit. Commercial monitors marketed as sudden infant death syndrome. Prevention are not proven to prevent it. Consumer pulse oximetry wearables for infants were marketed using the same framework, the implication of protection against the thing parents fear most, without the clinical evidence required to support that claim as a medical device. The Food and Drug Administration clearance process for medical devices requires demonstrated safety and efficacy. These products reached the consumer market as general wellness devices, outside that clearance pathway, with marketing language calibrated to the parent's fear rather than to the evidence about what the device actually does. 72. The infant swing used as a sleep location solved the immediate problem. The infant would sleep in it when they would not sleep in the crib, and introduced a respiratory geometry problem that the exhausted parent at 3 in the morning had no framework to assess. An infant in a reclined swing position may have their chin drop toward their chest as muscle tone decreases with sleep depth. The airway in that position is flexed at the neck, and the diameter reduction from chin to chest flexion in a young infant is not trivial. Positional asphyxia from inclined or flexed sleeping positions has been documented in infants, particularly in those under 4 months, whose neck muscles cannot maintain airway alignment during deep sleep. The Consumer Product Safety Commission's recall of the Fisher-Price Rock and Play sleeper in 2019 involved approximately 4.7 million units and was linked to infant deaths. The Safe Sleep for Babies Act, enacted in 2022, banned the sale of inclined infant sleepers with inclines greater than 10 degrees. The American Academy of Pediatrics Safe Sleep specification requires a flat surface of less than 10 degrees. No swing, bouncer, or angled sleeper meets that specification for routine sleep use. The swing solved the sleep problem. The airway geometry during that sleep was a variable no one had checked. 73. The nightlight in the nursery was installed to help the infant sleep better, which makes it a reasonable intervention for the correct problem aimed in the wrong biological direction. Light exposure suppresses melatonin production. Melatonin suppression delays sleep onset and reduces sleep quality. These are not contested findings. They are the basis of every recommendation about screen time before bed for adults, applied to a population with a dramatically lower threshold for melatonin suppression than the adult studies were conducted on. Infants do not produce their own melatonin until approximately 3 months of age. After that point, the developing circadian system is being calibrated by light exposure cues, and consistent darkness during nighttime sleep hours is one of the primary environmental inputs that accelerates circadian consolidation. The developmental process that produces longer, more consolidated nighttime sleep, which is the outcome every parent in this situation is trying to achieve. Research on light exposure and melatonin suppression in infants shows that light levels as low as 40 to 60 lux, typical nightlight range, can suppress melatonin in infants. Blue spectrum LED nightlights, which became dominant as incandescent bulbs were phased out, are the most potent melatonin suppressors in the wavelength range. The nightlight's primary biological effect was a measurable argument against the sleep it was installed to support. 74. The TRIS story begins with a legitimate regulatory goal and ends with a carcinogen on 30 million children's garments. The flammability standard for children's sleepwear was enacted to prevent burn injuries, a real harm with a documented injury record. The standard required that sleepwear meet a flame-resistant specification. The chemical treatment selected to meet that specification was TRIS, short for TRES, 2,3-dibromopropyl phosphate. TRES was applied to approximately 50 million children's garments sold in the United States before the Consumer Product Safety Commission banned it in 1977, following research demonstrating that it was absorbed through skin, mutagenic in bacterial assays, and carcinogenic in animal studies. The sleepwear was worn against skin during the hours of maximum skin contact. Overnight. Every night. For years. The regulatory sequence produced a fire safety standard that mandated a chemical that introduced a carcinogenic exposure pathway, and the ban on that chemical required manufacturers to either adopt alternative flame retardants or switch to inherently flame-resistant fabrics. Some alternative retardants subsequently identified as developmental and endocrine concerns entered the supply chain after TRS was removed. The fire safety regulation was correct. The chemical safety regulation was correct. Both arrived after the exposure, and the gap between the two correct answers was the children wearing the garments. 75. Early television, marketed as educational programming for infants, operated on an intuitive premise. An infant watching educational content is receiving educational input that developmental psychology tested and did not confirm. The video deficit effect is a well-established finding in the research literature. Infants and toddlers under approximately 30 months consistently perform worse on learning and imitation tasks taught via video than the same tasks taught by a live person delivering identical content. The deficit is not about quality of content. It is about the medium. The developmental mechanism involves the infant's inability to transfer information from a two-dimensional representation to the three-dimensional world. A cognitive mapping task that is not available to the infant brain until approximately 18 to 24 months of development. Baby Einstein was the dominant brand in infant media marketing through the late 1990s and 2000s. Disney agreed to offer refunds to dissatisfied customers in 2009, following research showing the videos provided no educational benefit and some evidence of association with vocabulary delays in heavy users. The American Academy of Pediatrics revised its screen time guidance to recommend zero screen media for children under 18 months, except video chatting, specifically because the developmental evidence showed no learning benefit from the format. The educational programming produced no education in the population it was designed to educate, which the packaging did not indicate. 76. Homemade infant formula prepared from evaporated milk, water, and corn syrup is described in family oral tradition as what grandmothers used, which is accurate, and as something that worked fine, which requires more precision. The evaporated milk formula that was used in mid-20th century United States pediatric practice was nutritionally inadequate in iron, vitamin C, vitamin D, and essential fatty acids. Deficiencies that were not fully characterized at the time the formula was in common use. The infants who received it and survived did so in the context of an infant mortality rate from nutritional causes that was significantly higher than current rates. The grandmother-era formula worked for the infants who survived it. The ones who did not are not in the oral tradition. During the 2022 United States infant formula shortage, the Food and Drug Administration and the American Academy of Pediatrics issued emergency guidance explicitly warning against all homemade formula for infants under 12 months, citing hospitalization cases of infants harmed by homemade preparations. Water dilution of formula, adding more water than specified to stretch the supply, causes hyponatremia in infants whose kidneys cannot compensate for excess free water, with neurological consequences including seizures. The tradition was real. The nutritional adequacy was partial. The survival rate in the era before the comparison was available was doing a lot of work in the confidence. 77, the homeopathic teething tablet was positioned in natural parenting retail as the alternative to pharmaceutical teething relief, a gentle plant-derived option for parents who wanted to avoid medication side effects. The Food and Drug Administration's warnings about Hyland's homeopathic teething tablets in 2010 and again in 2016 reported something that undermined the product's positioning from both directions simultaneously. Laboratory testing found variable and unpredictably high levels of belladonna alkaloids in some product lots. Belladonna contains atropine, hyoscine, and hyoscyamine, anticholinergic compounds with narrow therapeutic windows in infants. The homeopathic manufacturing process, if performed correctly, should reduce active ingredients to pharmacologically negligible levels through serial dilution. The FDA findings suggested inconsistent dilution quality control, meaning the products were neither what homeopathic theory predicts, pharmacologically inert, nor what pharmaceutical standards require, consistently dosed. The FDA received reports of infant seizures, breathing difficulties, and deaths temporally associated with the product. The company disputed the findings initially. A voluntary recall followed in 2016. The FDA does not evaluate homeopathic products for safety or efficacy before market entry. The natural alternative to medication contained medication at inconsistent doses with no dose verification, which is a combination that managed to be worse than either the category it rejected or the category it claimed to belong to. 78. The Victorian pram canopy, draped with a blanket or muslin to protect the infant from direct sun, was tested in 2018 by researchers who published the results in Acta Pediatrica, and the results were that internal temperature inside the covered pram rose rapidly compared to an uncovered pram, with dramatically reduced airflow measured at the infant's level. The physics are not complex. Blocking convective airflow over the pram interior while the carriage body absorbs solar radiation creates a greenhouse effect at infant level. The covering that appears to be shielding the infant from the sun's heat is trapping the heat that the carriage body has already absorbed, while eliminating the air circulation that would otherwise carry it away. Victorian infant mortality statistics include significant warm season infant death rates that contemporary accounts attributed to summer disease and cholera infantum. Diagnostic categories that encompass dehydration and heat-related illness without identifying the contributing environmental conditions. The pram canopy covering was not a Victorian-era practice. Swedish pediatricians specifically published the temperature measurement warning against draping muslin over pram hoods as recently as the period after the 2018 study, because the practice remains in common use among contemporary parents who have arrived at the same intuition the Victorians had about what shade means. The shade was not shade. It was a cover over a heat source with no ventilation. 79. The crib tent was a safety product for a real problem. Toddlers who learn to climb out of their cribs create a fall risk. The fall from crib rail height is significant, and the toddler who has climbed out unsupervised in the night is also unsupervised in whatever space they have now accessed. The crib tent addressed this by adding a mesh canopy over the crib interior that zipped shut. The Consumer Product Safety Commission recalled the tots in Mind Cozy Crib Tent in 2013, following the death of a toddler who became strangled in the product. The mesh canopy was held by a wire frame. When a toddler pressed against it from inside, the mesh deformed into folds and loops that could constrict around a neck or limb under the toddler's own weight. The CPSC subsequently recalled additional crib tent products and issued guidance against their use as a category. The recommended solution to a crib climbing toddler is transitioning the child to a floor-level toddler bed, which eliminates the fall height rather than adding a containment structure above it. The crib tent preserved the crib, preserved the fall height, and added a mesh entanglement surface over the space. It solved the climbing problem by introducing a different problem in the same location, and the different problem was worse. 80. The dresser in the nursery tips when a toddler pulls on an open drawer, and the dresser's weight does not prevent this, because weight is not the relevant variable in a tip-over load scenario. The relevant variable is the moment arm, the relationship between the height of the applied force and the width of the furniture's base. A tall, narrow dresser with an open drawer at mid-height creates a mechanical advantage that favors the toddler's pull over the furniture's mass. The Consumer Product Safety Commission's data shows a child is killed by tip-over furniture or televisions every 2 weeks in the United States. Wall anchoring straps cost approximately $10 to $15. Attach from the dresser's upper back rail to a wall stud, and resist the tip-over load through the structural connection to the building. The barrier to installing them is not cost or availability. It is the belief that a heavy dresser is stable against a toddler, a belief that the physics of the moment arm calculation does not support, and that the injury data refutes with a frequency that the CPSC found sufficient to issue a mandatory standard. ASTM F2057 became mandatory under a Consumer Product Safety Commission rule effective 2023. Dressers manufactured before that date are not required to meet it. The ones that do not look identical to the ones that do from the outside. 81. The infant car seat carried by the handle with the infant inside is a use pattern the product was designed to accommodate, but that introduces a positional airway risk that the design's primary safety purpose, crash protection, did not address. An infant in a car seat carried at the caregiver's side is in a semi-reclined position with their head supported by the seat back. As the caregiver walks and the seat swings slightly with the gait, the infant's head can drop forward relative to the seat back, producing chin-to-chest airway flexion. In young infants, particularly those born preterm, this positional flexion reduces airway diameter measurably. Neonatal intensive care unit discharge protocols include a car seat challenge, a period of monitored time in the car seat before discharge, specifically because oxygen desaturation events in car seat positions have been documented in preterm and some term infants. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends limiting time in car seats outside of vehicle travel for this reason. The cultural use of the infant car seat as a primary transport device, a nap location, and a general holding solution was not the scenario the seat was designed and validated for. The handle implied portability. The airway geometry during ambulatory transport was a question the design validation process addressed for crash performance and not for the walk across the parking lot. 82. The cabinet lock that a motivated toddler can defeat within 90 seconds is not a lock in any functional sense. It is a device that adds a step between the toddler and the hazardous content, and whether that step is sufficient depends entirely on how long the step takes, relative to the toddler's problem-solving persistence, and how consistently the adult re-engages the lock after every use. Child-resistant packaging standards under the Poison Prevention Packaging Act of 1970 were designed to slow access, not prevent it. The standard tests are based on a panel of children under 5 completing an open and close sequence within 5 minutes. A meaningful delay in some scenarios and no barrier at all in others. Poison control call rates for children under 5 ingesting household chemicals have remained relatively stable despite decades of child-proofing product proliferation. The products reduce access time. They do not substitute for the storage discipline of keeping hazardous materials in locations that are genuinely inaccessible, locked with a key, on a high shelf, in a separate room. The child-proofing market generated confidence that the installed hardware was equivalent to genuine prevention. The hardware was a delay mechanism. The toddler's motivation was unlimited, and the adult's re-engagement with the lock after every use was the actual safety system, which the cabinet lock packaging did not explain. 83 BPA in polycarbonate plastic baby bottles was not a trace contaminant or a background environmental exposure. It was a structural component of the bottle material. Bisphenol A is the monomer used to manufacture polycarbonate plastic, meaning it is present throughout the material in quantity and migrates out under the conditions of normal use. The conditions that accelerate migration are heat and repeated mechanical stress. The standard preparation method for formula in polycarbonate bottles involved heating, in a microwave, in hot water, or by mixing with hot formula, which is the precise condition that maximizes BPA release into the liquid the infant then consumes. BPA is an estrogen-mimicking compound. Its endocrine-disrupting properties were identified in research from the 1990s onward. Endocrine disruption during developmental windows has disproportionate long-term effects compared to equivalent adult exposures because the developmental windows are not recoverable. The biological events that occur during them are time-dependent and do not repeat. The Food and Drug Administration maintained that BPA in food contact materials was safe until 2012, when it banned BPA from baby bottles and sippy cups. By that point, major manufacturers had already switched materials in response to consumer pressure, meaning the market moved before the regulator did. The glass bottles that polycarbonate replaced were arguably the safer product, and the modern scientific upgrade introduced the exposure they replaced. 84. The hypoallergenic label on an infant skincare product communicates the impression of a tested, regulated, clinically validated claim. It communicates this impression without legal support because the Food and Drug Administration proposed a regulation defining hypoallergenic for cosmetic products in 1975. The regulation was overturned in court, and no replacement definition has been established in the United States since. The term means whatever the manufacturer decides it means. Products labeled hypoallergenic have been tested in clinical studies and found to cause allergic reactions in sensitized individuals at rates comparable to products without the label for specific allergens. The dermatological community uses hypoallergenic to mean formulated to minimize common allergens, a voluntary practice based on avoiding a list of known sensitizers. This is not a verified outcome, it is a formulation intention. Infant skincare products carrying hypoallergenic claims frequently contain botanical extracts, lavender, chamomile, calendula, that appear on dermatological sensitizer lists and coexist with the hypoallergenic claim on the same label without apparent awareness of the internal contradiction. You purchased the product because the label communicated clinical precision. The label communicated the manufacturer's formulation intention and nothing beyond that, in a regulatory environment that has not required anything more since the 1975 definition was struck down. 85. The multiple layers of clothing on a newborn communicated love, care, and responsible thermal management, and overheating communicated nothing except a physiological risk factor that has been identified in sudden infant death syndrome research as a modifiable variable. The American Academy of Pediatrics Sleep Temperature Guidance recommends dressing an infant in one layer more than an adult would wear comfortably in the same room. The cultural norm in many households, particularly in cold weather, involves a baseline outfit, a swaddle blanket, and additional covering, a layering approach that routinely exceeds the one additional layer recommendation. The proposed mechanism linking overheating to sudden infant death syndrome involves heat's effect on infant arousal thresholds during sleep. An overheated infant may have a reduced arousal response to the respiratory challenges that the arousal system would otherwise correct, the same arousal system deficit that prone sleeping implicates. The shift towards synthetic fiber sleepwear, driven by post-tris flammability requirements, increased the thermal retention of infant garments at the same time that safe sleep guidance was recommending against overheating. Heat loss in infants occurs primarily through the head, which traditional infant clothing covered with a bonnet during sleep. Head covering during sleep removes the primary cooling mechanism while adding the thermal retention of a fabric layer over the body's main heat dissipation surface. Every additional layer communicated care. The thermoregulation was heading in a different direction. 86. The traditional cradle beside the parent's bed represents the one piece of historical infant sleeping practice that modern guidance has vindicated. Room sharing is the current American Academy of Pediatrics recommendation for at least the first 6 months, which makes it particularly useful as an example of how you can get the location right and everything else wrong simultaneously. The historical wooden cradle featured soft quilts, sheepskin liners, pillow inserts, draped canopy fabric, and a rocking mechanism operable by a sibling's foot or a parent's hand during the night. It was enclosed enough to pool rebreathed air. It was soft enough to conform to a face. It was covered enough to reduce airflow. The modern safe sleep specification for the same room sharing arrangement requires a firm, flat surface with less than 10 degrees of incline. No soft objects, no loose bedding, no canopy, no incline, and no positioning devices. That list of requirements is a complete structural redesign of the traditional cradle that preserves only one element of the original, the location in the parent's room. Everything else the historical cradle provided was something the modern standard exists specifically to exclude. Room sharing was the right answer. The implementation was the entire list of wrong answers, and they coexisted in the same piece of furniture for centuries. 87. Breast milk is nutritionally exceptional, and it contains insufficient vitamin D to prevent deficiency in exclusively breastfed infants. Both of those statements are true. They are not in conflict, and the second one is not communicated to most breastfeeding families at the point when it would be useful. Human breast milk contains approximately 25 international units of vitamin D per liter. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends 400 international units per day for breastfed infants. Breast milk at typical production volumes provides approximately 6% of the recommended daily intake. Vitamin D deficiency in infancy causes rickets, impaired bone mineralization that produces skeletal deformity, a condition that was widespread in industrialized urban populations before fortification programs, and that did not disappear with the availability of commercial formula. It persisted, and persists, in exclusively breastfed infants whose mothers are also vitamin D deficient, because maternal vitamin D status directly affects breast milk vitamin D content. The American Academy of Pediatrics has recommended 400 international units of vitamin D supplementation daily for all breastfed infants since 2008. Surveys consistently show that the majority of breastfeeding families are unaware of the recommendation or do not follow it. The supplement is inexpensive, widely available, and requires 1 drop per day. The gap is not access. It is that the recommendation does not reliably reach the parent during the clinical encounters where it should be delivered. 88. The incline sleeper category existed in retail for approximately a decade before the regulatory framework caught up with the injury data, and the injury data was available before the framework moved. The Fisher-Price Rock and Play Sleeper was a widely purchased, highly rated consumer product before its recall in 2019, involving approximately 4.7 million units linked to infant deaths. The product placed infants in an inclined, semi-reclined position that created the positional airway risk described in Item 72. The Safe Sleep for Babies Act, enacted in 2022, banned the manufacture and sale of inclined infant sleepers with inclines greater than 10 degrees in the United States. A federal legislative action that required a law because the voluntary standards process had not produced a mandatory prohibition quickly enough to remove the product from the market. The same legislation banned padded crib bumpers federally for the same reason. the voluntary standard pathway had not produced a removal. The act represented Congress acting on a product safety issue because the Consumer Product Safety Commission's voluntary standard process had not resolved it within the injury timeline. The inclined sleeper ban and the crib bumper ban are in the same piece of legislation, which means both product categories accumulated enough harm data to require a federal law before the market removed them. 89 Fluoride toothpaste for infants and toddlers is recommended by both the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Dental Association from the appearance of the first tooth. The recommended amount for children under 3 is a rice grain-sized quantity, a specification that exists because the infant and toddler who cannot reliably spit will swallow essentially all applied toothpaste, and fluoride ingestion above the recommended dose during tooth development causes dental fluorosis. Dental fluorosis is permanent. It occurs during enamel formation when excess fluoride incorporation disrupts the crystal matrix of the developing enamel, producing white opacity or brown pitting that appears when those teeth erupt, which for permanent teeth means the consequence of an exposure during the first years of life appears years later when the permanent dentition comes in. The full stripe toothpaste application shown in adult product marketing and reproduced on some children's toothpaste packaging delivers 4 to 10 times the recommended quantity for an infant or toddler. The balance between the dose that prevents dental caries and the dose that causes fluorosis has a narrow margin in young children that a stripe length comparison to adult product packaging does not communicate. The amount matters. The rice grain specification is not a suggestion about aesthetics. It is the dose calculation for a population that cannot spit. 90. The changing table safety strap has a use rate estimated at under 40% in consumer research, which means the majority of diaper changes on elevated surfaces are happening without the restraint that the elevated surface requires. An unrestrained infant on a changing table is on a 36-inch surface chosen for adult ergonomic convenience. Next to a diaper, a container of wipes, and frequently a phone, in the developmental period when rolling, the motor milestone most relevant to falling off a surface, is actively emerging and specifically unpredictable in its timing. Infants who have not yet rolled independently produce their first roll on changing tables at a documented and non-trivial rate, because the reaching and straining behavior associated with items at the table edge activates the same movement pattern. The Consumer Product Safety Commission estimates over 50,000 infants are treated in emergency rooms annually for falls from furniture, with changing table falls representing a meaningful portion of that total. The restraint strap requires approximately 3 additional seconds to engage relative to not engaging it. The infant's rolling timeline is not synchronized to the adult's assessment of whether today is the day the rolling milestone arrives. The strap was there. The 3 seconds were available. The restraint use rate suggests the 3 seconds were consistently deprioritized against other variables in the change sequence. 91, the toy chest recalled, the crib bumper banned, the inclined sleeper removed from shelves, and in the attic, the product you stored between children is waiting. It was not in a crash. It looks fine. You remember it working without incident the first time, which is an accurate memory of the product's performance, before whatever intervening safety finding prompted the recall action that you did not receive, because the product was not registered, and the recall notification system reaches only registered owners. Consumer product registration rates for baby gear are estimated at under 30% of sales. A product stored between children's uses is not monitored for recall status. The parent's mental model of the product is fixed at the last time of use, before any safety finding that occurred during the storage interval. Material degradation during storage adds to the existing concern. Foam hardens, elastic loses tension, plastic components embrittled by temperature cycling fail at lower loads than when the product was new. The Consumer Product Safety Commission's recall database at recalls.gov allows search by product category and date range. Checking it requires knowing the search exists, which requires having been told, which requires the information to have reached you through a channel you were monitoring. The attic is not a channel anyone was monitoring. 92. The bath toy organizer, the mesh bag hung at bathtub waterline to store squeeze toys and rubber figures between uses, is a mold cultivation device positioned at the level where the infant reaches. In the room where the objects it holds will be placed directly into the infant's mouth during the next bath. A study by Swiss and American researchers published in 2018 found that 80% of bath toys tested contained fungi, and 60% contained potentially harmful bacteria, including species of Legionella and Pseudomonas. The internal water trapping mechanism of squeeze toys creates an ideal growth environment, warm from the bath, moist, and nutrient-rich from soap residue, skin cells, and the fecal contamination present in any infant bath water. The mesh storage bag prolongs the external surface moisture and maintains humidity in the toy cluster between baths, extending the growth window rather than interrupting it. The infant's use pattern for a squeeze toy, compressing it into the mouth and releasing, delivers the internally stored water directly to the oral mucosa. The contaminated water is delivered to the infant by the toy's intended function. The storage solution optimized for keeping the toys wet between uses, which is also the condition optimized for the biology happening inside them. And the infant was conducting the quality control check with their mouth. 93. The Metsitsa Bapé practice, oral suction of a newborn circumcision wound, has been defended through centuries of tradition and litigated through years of public health conflict, and the biological mechanism at issue is not contested by either side. Oral contact with an open wound on an immunologically naive newborn creates a direct transmission pathway for any pathogen present in the practitioner's oral cavity. Herpes simplex virus type 1. Oral herpes has a seroprevalence in adults high enough that many practitioners carry it asymptomatically. Neonatal herpes infection, occurring in the first 28 days of life, carries a mortality rate of approximately 85% if disseminated and untreated. Even with antiviral treatment, neonatal herpes encephalitis produces significant neurological impairment in survivors. The New York City Department of Health documented 17 cases of neonatal herpes between 2000 and 2012 attributed to this practice, including 2 infant deaths and 2 cases of permanent brain damage. The New York City Health Department implemented a parental informed consent requirement beginning in 2012. Subsequent litigation challenged the requirement on religious freedom grounds. Modern Orthodox rabbinical authorities have advocated for alternative methods, sterile gauze, pipette suction, as halakhically acceptable, with adoption varying by community. The wound protection measure was a direct transmission pathway for one of the most dangerous pathogens a newborn encounters. The conflict between that fact and centuries of practice has not been resolved. 94. The bright overhead light turned on for a nighttime feeding resets the circadian clock of both people in the room at the moment when returning both of them to sleep as quickly as possible is the only objective that matters. Light exposure at night suppresses melatonin and signals the circadian system that daytime has begun. A blue spectrum LED overhead light at 2 in the morning produces a circadian reset that extends the time to sleep onset after the feed for the infant and for the adult, both of whom need to return to sleep in the shortest possible interval. Circadian entrainment in infants develops over the first 3 to 4 months, and consistent light cues, bright light during the day, minimal light during the night, are among the primary environmental inputs that accelerate consolidation of longer nighttime sleep periods. Red spectrum light has significantly lower melatonin suppression capacity than blue spectrum light. A dim, red-toned light source for nighttime feeds is a grounded alternative that preserves enough visibility for a safe feeding without signaling daytime to either circadian system. This information is available in the infant sleep literature. It is not in the instruction materials that come with the overhead light fixture installed in the nursery before the baby arrived. And it is not the first thing most parents encounter in the first week of nighttime feeds. 95. The ribbon, the bow, the decorative curled accent on the infant gift, presented at the hospital, placed on the hat, tied to the package in the gift bag sitting on the nursery floor, is a choking hazard, a strangulation hazard, or both, depending on its length and how securely it is attached to the item it is decorating. The Consumer Product Safety Commission's regulations for children's clothing under age 3 prohibit functional drawstrings in hood and neck areas for documented safety reasons. Decorative ribbons and bows exist in a different regulatory category with less comprehensive standards than the toy and functional clothing framework. A bow on an infant hat positioned at face level is within reach of the newborn hand-to-face movement pattern. A detached bow is dimensionally appropriate for partial airway obstruction in a newborn airway. Gift wrapping ribbons left accessible on the nursery floor after a celebration are cord-length hazards in the same room as a mobile infant whose developmental schedule for mobility is not synchronized with the adult's timeline for tidying up after a party. The item was presented as a gift for a baby. The decoration on the gift was outside the safety review that governs gifts for babies. Both of those things were true at the same moment in the same room. 96. The unvented gas heater placed in the nursery for supplemental warmth in a cold house solved the temperature problem and introduced a combustion chemistry problem in an enclosed room whose primary occupant has the smallest physiological margin before impairment of any person in the household. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin approximately 200 to 250 times more readily than oxygen. Fetal and infant hemoglobin, which persists for months after birth, binds carbon monoxide even more readily than adult hemoglobin, meaning infants accumulate toxic levels faster than adults in an identical exposure environment. An unvented combustion appliance in a sealed nursery consumes oxygen and produces carbon monoxide progressively throughout the night. Carbon monoxide produces no odor and no visible indicator. An infant experiencing carbon monoxide impairment communicates through crying, which may be attributed to any of the other variables that cause nighttime crying, until the impairment advances beyond the crying stage. The United Kingdom's Health and Safety Executive issued warnings specifically against unvented gas heaters in sleeping spaces. Several sudden infant death syndrome investigations in the 1980s and 90s identified carbon monoxide as a contributing variable in cases that had been classified under the syndrome's diagnostic umbrella. The heater solved the cold. The combustion byproduct was the detail that did not appear on the product description, and the nursery had no way to measure it. 97. The natural insect repellent formulated with essential oils instead of DET is a less effective product used in contexts where effectiveness is the variable that determines whether a mosquito-borne illness is transmitted. Essential oil-based repellents provide protection durations of 20 minutes to 2 hours in comparative testing. DET formulations at 25 to 30% concentration provide protection durations of 6 to 8 hours under the same conditions. In a high mosquito environment with active transmission of dengue, Zika, West Nile virus, or malaria, the gap between 20 minutes and 6 hours of protection is the gap during which the exposure occurs. The Environmental Protection Agency, the Centers for Disease Control, and the American Academy of Pediatrics consider DET safe for infants over 2 months of age at concentrations up to 30% when applied per label instructions. The AAP recommends DET-based repellents, specifically in areas with mosquito-borne disease risk, because the risk-benefit calculation, comparing DET's established low-risk profile to the risk of the diseases being transmitted, favors DET in those contexts. The natural repellent protected against the idea of mosquito exposure for approximately 20 minutes per application. In a transmission environment, 20 minutes is the product's window and the mosquito's opportunity, and the infant's immune system was not consulted about the preference for the natural option. 98. The window sunlight used to treat a jaundiced newborn passes through glass, and the glass filters out the specific wavelengths that make medical phototherapy work while transmitting the wavelengths that burn infant skin. Medical phototherapy for neonatal jaundice uses blue-green light in the wavelength range of approximately 430 to 490 nanometers, delivered at a specified irradiance level measured in microwatts per centimeter squared per nanometer. Standard window glass transmits light in this visible wavelength range, but at intensities far below the therapeutic threshold required by clinical phototherapy devices. The folk reasoning, phototherapy uses light, sunlight contains light, therefore sunlight is phototherapy, collapses at the irradiance measurement. Direct outdoor sunlight without glass filtering does contain the therapeutic wavelength at marginally useful irradiance, but maintaining a jaundiced newborn in direct outdoor sun introduces thermoregulation, dehydration, and ultraviolet burn risks that make uncontrolled outdoor sun exposure a poor substitute for a device that delivers calibrated light at controlled intensity and temperature. Untreated severe neonatal jaundice causes kernicterus, bilirubin deposition in brain tissue producing permanent neurological damage. The window light delay is time away from a treatment that works, spent on a substitute that looks like the treatment, because it comes from the same direction as the sun that makes the treatment possible. 99. The recalled product that is currently in your attic is the final item on this list because it is not historical. It is not Victorian, not mid-century, not from an era before the Consumer Product Safety Commission existed. It is a product you purchased, stored, and are planning to reuse, and the recall may have been issued during the interval between the first child and the next one, during the months or years when the product was in the attic, and you were not monitoring its safety status. Consumer product registration rates for baby gear are estimated at under 30% of sales. Unregistered owners receive no recall notification. The Consumer Product Safety Commission's recall database is publicly searchable at recalls.gov by product category and date range. Checking it requires knowing it exists and doing it. The product in the attic was not in a crash, was stored carefully, and looks fine. The foam inside has been aging. The elastic has been losing tension. The plastic has been responding to temperature cycling. The safety finding that prompted the recall was documented after the last time you used the product and before the next time you plan to. The attic is a location, not a safety review. The database is a 3-minute search. Only one of those two things tells you whether the product your next child will use has been recalled. 100. The window sunlight jaundice treatment, the homemade formula, the belly sleep recommendation, the crib bumper sold as a safety product. Each of these was not practiced by negligent parents or promoted by careless professionals. Each was the best available guidance at the time it was followed, issued with the confidence of the information architecture that existed by people who were genuinely trying to protect the infants in their care. The pattern that runs through all 100 items on this list is not malice or indifference. It is the sequence. Product or practice first, evidence second, correction third, and the correction traveling more slowly than the original recommendation did. You were not failed by bad actors. You were the recipient of the best available guidance in an era before the evidence that revised it had been collected. The consumer safety infrastructure, the mandatory standards, the injury surveillance systems, the recall mechanisms, the pediatric guideline revision process exists specifically to shorten the gap between the harm and the correction. It works imperfectly. It works slowly. The sequence has not fundamentally changed. What has changed is the speed of the evidence cycle and your ability to access the correction when it arrives. The only variable you control is how quickly you update when it does. That is the entire lesson. 101. The complete list of things currently considered safe that will appear on a version of this list in 50 years does not exist yet because the evidence has not been collected. That is not a reassuring statement. It is an accurate one. Every item on this list was on the confident side of the evidence line at the moment it was practiced. The baby cage was a patent. The opium syrup was a pharmacy product. The belly sleep recommendation was in the pediatric manual. The crib bumper was in the safety aisle. The arc from confident practice to documented harm to corrective action ran through every one of them. And the arc is running through products and practices in use right now on the same timeline. And the evidence is being collected somewhere by someone, and it has not arrived yet. What you do with that is not panic. The infrastructure is better than it was. The evidence cycle is faster. The correction mechanism exists and functions. What you do with it is stay current. Check the recall database. Read the updated guideline when it arrives, and resist the confidence that comes from the fact that something has been working without incident so far. So far is where every item on this list was, right before it wasn't. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.